Indicted on criminal charges, now moments away from surrendering to authorities right here in New York City. Former President Donald Trump, a short time from now, will be arraigned. He'll be brought before a judge in Lower Manhattan. And of course, you're looking live at Trump Tower, the scene outside Trump Tower, where at any minute, the former president, who of course is now running for president for a third time, will emerge and will make his way down to the courthouse in Lower Manhattan. In fact, our reporting team tells us he's actually in the elevator in Trump Tower, making his way down right now. He'll travel through Midtown Manhattan, escorted by the Secret Service and the NYPD. It's about a 4-mile trip to criminal court in Lower Manhattan. When he gets there, he's expected to be brought into the courthouse rather quickly, brought into an elevator there, straight up to the 15th floor. It's our understanding that there will be cameras in the hallway when he gets off the elevator, but not in the courtroom. The Trump team had argued last night against television cameras in court, the Trump team saying that it would create a circus-like atmosphere. The camera right there, though, trained on Trump Tower, the former president expected to emerge at any moment. Now, in the courtroom, we also know it's believed there will be still cameras to capture images right before the proceedings. The first president, former or current, to ever face criminal charges. The former president spent the night in Trump Tower, we're told, huddled with his legal team, preparing for what is about to come. In fact, our Catherine Falders reporting a short time ago that the former president is expected to plead not guilty himself, not his lawyers in court, that he will speak himself in court. The indictment still sealed, but the former president and the public set to learn just a short time from now what charges the former president will face. Sources have already told ABC News, as we've been reporting for several days here, that he'll face more than 24 separate charges, all stemming from that investigation into the hush money payment to Stormy Daniels, all for her to keep quiet in the crucial final weeks before the 2016 presidential election. The payment, as you likely know, was made by his then lawyer, his fixer, his one-time friend, Michael Cohen, who, of course, was convicted and served prison time for this. Michael Cohen, now a central witness in this case. Cohen knows that he's become a target of Trump and his supporters, but he has repeatedly said that there will be evidence to back up everything he has told prosecutors in this case. Again, you're looking live. Pictures are cameras trained outside Trump Tower. Obviously, you see movement there, the Secret Service, the NYPD, for this 4-mile trip down to Lower Manhattan. Police have, of course, locked down security around Trump Tower and the courthouse, where we have seen a small number of Trump supporters gathered. In fact, so far, our reporters have noted often the number of reporters actually outnumbering those who have gathered. And so now we watch the motorcade on the move here in Manhattan. Lindsay Davis outside Trump Tower. Lindsay, what have you seen?
David, if you blinked, you would have missed his departure. He gave a brief wave to the crowd and then got right into that motorcade. I think that a lot of people who are gathered here along Fifth Avenue are not even aware that he has already departed the building, because people are still holding up cameras trying to perhaps get a glimpse of the former president. Fifth Avenue, as you know, has long been a coveted address with high-end buildings, and today, clearly, that's not the draw. We have maybe 10 people deep just on the other side of the camera here lining Fifth Avenue. Many of the people here, tourists. It is remarkably peaceful, very quiet here, people just watching. I started kind of just asking as I was walking down Fifth Avenue, you know, why are you here? Are you a Trump supporter? The majority of the people said they're not Trump supporters, some giving some choice words explaining that they were anti-Trump. There was a little girl, 10 years old, who said that he's a mean man who's done bad things, and she wanted to see him go to jail today. But again, because it's an international crowd, it's interesting. A lot of the people seem to really not have a strong opinion about it. You have a handful of people maybe who have signs in support of Trump, but even they are not protesting in any way. Certainly a historic day for Americans. The native New Yorker who grew up here and found a lot of fame and prominence here in New York City, returning here to what was once his primary residence, but for this day, of course, to face the judge and be fingerprinted. But interestingly, David, you know, as you know, he had urged his supporters to protest, suggesting that there might be potential death and destruction. We are seeing none of that. Mayor Adams, of course, warned people that New York City stands at the ready and said to any potential rabble-rousers to behave. It seems that people are doing just that, David.
Lindsay Davis outside Trump Tower, and as Lindsay aptly put it, if you blinked, you missed it. The former president leaving Trump Tower very quickly, getting into the motorcade. Again, the Secret Service assisting, but the NYPD taking the lead here today as they make that 4-mile trip now down to Lower Manhattan and to criminal court. Obviously, it will not take nearly as long as it would take on a typical day in Manhattan. Traffic has been cleared away. So have pedestrians in many parts of New York to make this trip as efficient as possible for the former president in making his way to Lower Manhattan. We are getting new reporting this morning on what will play out this afternoon here in New York. Our senior investigative reporter, Aaron Katersky, live outside the courthouse. Aaron, take us through what we know so far, what the American people will witness, what we won't see, and how this arraignment will unfold here.
David, former President Trump is on his way here to surrender as the defendant in the People of the State of New York against Donald J. Trump. He's going to arrive here at the criminal courthouse through a side entrance that has already been blocked off in anticipation of his arrival. All of the cars, including the district attorney's vehicle, have been cleared from the block so the president can come in unencumbered. He's immediately going to be taken inside to the district attorney's office for processing, where he will be formally placed under arrest and processed and booked as a criminal defendant. A short time later, he will be taken to the 15th floor to a courtroom where he will be arraigned. We're told he's going to use a special elevator ordinarily reserved for the judges, and that will put him right at the entrance to the courtroom, so he may only be in the hallway a few minutes, just mere steps. Once inside, he will be seated in the well of the courtroom, and that is something the American people have never seen. A former occupant of the Oval Office seated at the defense table of a criminal courtroom, surrounded by his lawyers, Susan Necklace and Todd Blanche, a former federal prosecutor who was recently added to the defense team. There will be no television cameras inside. The judge wouldn't allow it. But, David, he is allowing a number of photographers to snap pictures for a few minutes before the arraignment begins. So we will undoubtedly see the former president seated there. And I'm curious about some of these dynamics. Ordinarily, a president of the United States is the most important person in the room. Everybody stands in honor of his arrival. Here, he will have to stand when Judge Juan Merchan comes on the bench to preside over his arraignment, David.
An extraordinary scene Aaron Katersky describes that will unfold in Lower Manhattan just moments from now. For those of you joining us, this is ABC News live coverage of what is history in the making. Never before have we seen a president, former or current, criminally charged on the trip to Lower Manhattan to criminal court to face those charges. He'll be arraigned moments from now. Of course, you're looking at the East River. The FDR is the route taken by the NYPD and the Secret Service. There have been some questions earlier in the day. Would it be Fifth Avenue, which is a straight trip right down to Lower Manhattan, the 4-mile trip, or would they take him over to the FDR? And of course, we all know that this is, before Mar-a-Lago became his home, New York City was the home of Donald Trump for many, many decades, born, raised here. This is all very familiar territory, and you can only imagine a bit surreal for him, even for someone who has faced multiple tests in decades as a businessman and then as the president of the United States. Legal tests along the way, but never has he faced a test like this one here that begins today. Criminal charges to be arraigned for those charges just moments from now. I want to bring in John Santucci, who has reported on Donald Trump for many years for us. John, you were the one reporting that he was coming down the elevator at Trump Tower. Any more color on the mood of the former president and the Trump team as they now head to Lower Manhattan to defend the former president?
A little bit, David, and I have to be honest, things don't usually shock me, but it looks like Donald Trump is actually in this vehicle by himself. He's with his agents, but usually Donald Trump has an aide, his lawyers, somebody by his side. I'm being told in real time the former president is by himself with his Secret Service detail, which is surprising given everything we've heard, David, within the last 24 hours, is that Donald Trump has been surrounded by people. He's back in his residence. You mentioned Trump Tower, a place that he lived for quite some time. I'm told last night that for many hours he was flanked by throngs of lawyers, lawyers that are working on this case, lawyers that have worked for him from some time at the Trump Organization, and lawyers that are also involved in the special counsel's investigation down in Washington. That is a two-pronged probe, as you well know, looking at January 6th and documents. I'm also told that a lot of phone calls from Trump last night and this morning, people described him to me, David, as quite calm. Our colleague, Catherine Falders, hearing he was upbeat as he was working the phone last night. I had another aide who told me that, as we've reported here on ABC, Donald Trump, post-White House, has become a frequent texter. And he was texting people last night saying, how do you think this is going to go today? What about the latest poll numbers? It seemed to be, David, as one aide put it to me, business as usual on a day that is anything but usual.
In addition to that reporting, John, Catherine Falders also indicating that the former president will plead not guilty himself.
That is our understanding, David. He will be in court surrounded by two lawyers, both familiar to the Trump team, if you will. Susan Necklace, who represented him and the company when they were facing the Manhattan DA last year in their probe looking at their failure to pay taxes for employees and other individuals. And another attorney who just formally joined Team Trump, Todd Blanche. He worked, of course, with Paul Manafort in their defense against special counsel Robert Mueller's probe, of course, when the president was in the White House.
John Santucci, who reported off-air on the Trump campaign leading up to 2016 and then on the Trump years in the presidency. John, our thanks to you with us all afternoon here, along with Catherine Falders and our entire political team standing by. Also, our reporters from New York City to Washington to West Palm Beach, where the president will end this day, the former president. And he is set in Mar-a-Lago to brief reporters again at the end of this historic day, though even though they've worked on what he will say, likely that could be tweaked given the temperature of what plays out in this courtroom here this morning. This is a surreal scene we're watching, Jonathan Karl, a live picture of the motorcade carrying Donald Trump. And as John just reported, Santucci there a moment ago, the former president alone with his Secret Service agents on the way down. This is not typical for the former president, who's usually surrounded by a small team that truly supports him.
Yeah, an incredible moment. This is a guy who's been the subject of countless criminal investigations, civil lawsuits, on down the line, certainly his entire time in politics, but before that as well. But now he is going to be booked the same way a common criminal will be booked at the courthouse on 100 Center Street in Lower Manhattan, a place where drug dealers and petty criminals of all kinds are regularly processed. And this time it'll be a former president. Truly a moment in this saga. But you know, I think to John's point, Trump has seen some other things happen over the past few days. One thing, that there have been polls that have come out that show him widening his lead over Ron DeSantis. He's raised, his team claims, $8 million since the indictment was revealed on Thursday. So this is now not just a criminal defendant facing this case and other cases, but a presidential candidate who is going to make fighting these indictments the centerpiece of his presidential campaign.
And we're going to carefully take our viewers through all of this as we're on the air here this afternoon. And as we look at this live picture, Pierre Thomas, our Chief Justice correspondent, it also speaks to when you see that this is all that's on the highway right now. You never see this in New York City, particularly at this hour. Obviously, this is the motorcade, the Secret Service, and the New York City Police Department hard at work here today. And all of the officers, some 35,000, put on heightened alert given what's playing out.
Absolutely, David. They have been planning for this for days. The Secret Service was in meetings with New York City officials over the weekend. And one official with the Secret Service I spoke to said that, look, we're confident we can get the president to where he needs to be quickly. We have the General Assembly here where there are hundreds of foreign dignitaries. We can do this. They're taking no chances. That route, as you can see, has been blocked off. I'm told around the courthouse, you won't be able to get anywhere near the courthouse, whatever. But the bottom line is they feel very confident that the crowds that you will see today will be largely peaceful, in part because of the message sent after January 6th. More than 1,000 people arrested. Many of them have been getting significant prison terms, and they believe that is a message of deterrence.
They're convinced that's a significant deterrent, particularly after what the country saw, what the world saw, and then the punishment that followed, even though it's taken many months. They have continued with all of those cases, and Pierre, you've reported extensively on that. We don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, but as Pierre and as Lindsay pointed out at Trump Tower, For the most part, the people outside Trump Tower were tourists who likely will never forget when they chose to visit New York, given the fact that they were outside Trump Tower when he came out very briefly, got into that motorcade. And again, if you looked away, you missed it. That motorcade again on the way down to criminal court, as John Carl just pointed out. There he is. This is the moment. A fist pump to the crowd. Lindsay saying that many of them, again, tourists, some not supporting the former president, though we're sure there were supporters there as well. And now the live picture downtown as they approach criminal court. And I think it was Aaron Katersky in the last 24 hours who spoke to the juxtaposition of this sort of luxury penthouse in Trump Tower, trading that this morning for sort of the hardened building of criminal court. Early this afternoon, where he'll now face arraignment. I want to bring in our legal analysts, Dan Abrams and Kate Shaw. And Kate, I want to begin with you just about the history being made this afternoon as we watch this unfold here in New York. Regardless of what you feel about the case, there's no questioning the fact that we simply have never witnessed anything like this.
No, so Donald Trump, of course, has faced all sorts of legal, obstacles. He's had civil suits when he was in business. He was twice impeached, tried in the Senate. But of course, there's never been a criminal case against, President or former President Donald Trump or any other president or former president in our history. It is monumental from a historical perspective. And yet it's important to remember right now, Donald Trump is an ex-president and he's just a private citizen. He's running for president. Of course, that's true too. But as a formal legal matter, he's someone subject to the criminal jurisdiction of the Manhattan DA or any other, law enforcement entity, just like anyone else. So it's enormously consequential historically. But it also, I think, speaks to this, equal justice under law principle that right now he is being booked like any other criminal defendant. He is presumed innocent until proven guilty like any other criminal defendant. And so you have the juxtaposition of those two, I think, dynamics.
And as we watch now, as the former president gets out and heads into the building there in Lower Manhattan, again, I know it's difficult to see from these aerial images, but we'll take you through it carefully, the moments that we are able to see. There had been some question about whether or not he would speak, even if briefly, before heading into the courthouse. Of course, we will bring that to you if and when that happens. Otherwise, we'll just take you right through the proceedings here this morning. And Kate Shaw, a question I know a lot of people at home are going to have: does this preclude in any way this indictment or even this notion of the potential conviction that could come or not if this is thrown out along the way? Does this in any way preclude him from running for president and even winning in 2024?
In a word, David, no. Nothing in the Constitution, nothing in the law prevents an individual under indictment or even under sentence from running for president or even serving for president. There might, of course, be logistical obstacles that a pending criminal prosecution would pose. And of course, if there were a conviction, arrangements would have to be made if, in fact, he were to win the presidency in the interim. But all you have to be is 35, natural-born citizen, resident for 14 years to run for president. This doesn't impact his eligibility one bit.
A reminder of our history from Kate Shaw here this morning as well. Dan Abrams also with us every step of the way, as he always is. And Dan, the point that Kate made, which I think is such an important one, is that Donald Trump has faced so many of these legal tests along the way, but never criminally charged, certainly as a former president. This notion that he'll be in the courtroom as a former president in front of Judge Merchan. Our reporting says he'll plead not guilty himself. Take us into that dynamic, how this will be different for a former president who has embraced the attention that has come with everything else, but who argued overnight, we don't want a circus-like atmosphere, no cameras in the court.
Yeah, this is the ultimate case where politics intersects with the law, right? You can't just view this case through a strictly legal prism, right? If we were to talk about this case and talk about what will happen when he arrives in court, who's going to do the commenting in court, et cetera, I would have all the answers for you in a typical case. This isn't a typical case. And Donald Trump, it seems himself, is going to be the one to say, I'm not guilty. Donald Trump is going to want to make both a legal comment, but that also has political significance. He knows that every single word that he utters in that courtroom will be reported when he leaves that courtroom. And so this particular proceeding here really is just a formality. It's the formal point where he learns exactly what the indictment is. He's going to plead not guilty. He's going to be booked and fingerprinted, and then he's going to go home. But for him, this is going to have more significance than just your typical formality. And I think that that's really important to remember as we look to see, you were talking before, is he going to make a comment before he goes in? We don't know.
And interesting on that point, Dan, it would appear that that they have foregone that opportunity, right? So they've given up on that opportunity, perhaps given just the feeling and the temperature of this as it plays out this afternoon. He is now inside the building. The former president choosing to get out of that motorcade to go inside without, appearing before any cameras in Lower Manhattan. I want to go back to Aaron Katersky because, Aaron, you sort of have the layout in your head because you've done so much reporting on this of what Donald Trump will do now that he's inside that building. It's our understanding he's been taken to an elevator up to the 15th floor to where that courtroom is. But even before he enters the courtroom, Aaron, there are cameras in the hallway to capture at least a couple of those moments before he goes before the judge.
And there are a couple of steps that will have to precede that elevator journey, David. He's entered on Hogan Place, which is adjacent to the courthouse named for the late and legendary New York County District Attorney Frank Hogan, going inside the Manhattan District Attorney's office for processing. We still aren't clear whether he needs to be photographed and fingerprinted like any other criminal defendant because he is so unlike any other criminal defendant. He will not be placed in handcuffs, but he will be formally placed under arrest, and only then will he be escorted up that private elevator and into the 15th floor courtroom for an arraignment where he is expected to plead not guilty to more than 24 felony charges. We still don't know what they are. They were filed under seal. Moments from now, we'll finally get a look at what exactly they are and why the people of the state of New York believe that Donald Trump is a criminal. His movements inside are largely private, save for those few steps off the elevator into the courtroom, and whether he decides to utter something on his way in or out will be up to him. But he is not free while he is inside and, in theory, in the custody of New York authorities, David.
Aaron, stick with us here. Again, as I mentioned moments ago, the former president foregoing any opportunity to speak before the cameras. And these are the images just in. This is moments ago. The former president, there you see him getting out of the motorcade, again, led to Lower Manhattan by the NYPD taking the lead, though the Secret Service obviously involved in protecting a former president. There he is walking into a side door at criminal court, surrounded by scaffolding, which is such a familiar sight if you've spent any time in New York City. Heading in, and as Aaron Katersky reported just moments ago, he'll be booked like any other criminal defendant now before he then makes that trip up to the 15th floor to appear before Judge Juan Merchan. And Aaron, I know for people at home who want to know just how typical this will be, there have been a lot of questions about whether or not he would be fingerprinted, whether or not there would be a mugshot. It's my understanding here in New York State, even if there is a mugshot, they don't issue those to the public. So if we were ever to see it, it would obviously be some sort of a leak in this case. What more, again, can you tell us about the routine that that the former president will undergo right now that's similar to anyone else who'd be entering criminal court?
As soon as he entered the New York County District Attorney's office, David, he technically surrendered himself for presentment in court for an arraignment on this still sealed indictment. Ordinarily, criminal defendants, as part of their processing, would be fingerprinted, a mugshot would be taken. We haven't been told whether any of that's going to be necessary. The former president's prints are on file here in New York because he used to have a gun permit here in Manhattan, and his photograph has been widely taken enough, and it's not thought that he represents any kind of a security threat that he might have to be identified later. So those formalities may or may not be taking place right now, but unquestionably he is being placed under arrest, and only then will he be brought up to court for an arraignment. And David, this courthouse is just the opposite of the opulence that he's used to, dimly lit, kind of grimy, and it's used to all manner of hardened criminal. This is the first defendant of a kind that any courthouse has seen in the country.
Aaron Katersky, our senior investigative reporter down in Lower Manhattan. Aaron, stick with us here as we continue our coverage. I want to bring in Robert Boyce, ABC News contributor, former NYPD chief of detectives. And Bob, perhaps you could help paint a portrait here of what the former president is doing right now. Obviously, we don't know exactly because there are no cameras in the building, and perhaps that's a good thing in preserving some sort of decorum here as we move through the afternoon. And we know the Trump team fought against cameras in the court, because of, in their words, it would create a circus-like atmosphere. But Bob, who does the former president sit across from right now? Who would he be communicating with? Something I had read said usually it is a detective or a former detective who would bring in a criminal, talk them through these initial steps. What do you imagine is playing out right now?
Right now, David, he's in the hands of the Manhattan District Attorney investigators, and they'll arrest him. And if everything goes to planning, which has been planned over the weekend and today, so he'll be taken to a singular room. He'll be fingerprinted with live scan, which is an automatic fingerprint machine, and then possibly photographed. And then at that point, he'll be moved up to the 15th floor in that special elevator Aaron spoke about earlier. So that's what they're doing right now. He is with the Secret Service. They leave him, and we don't think that's not going to happen. So it's a little unusual, but not out of the norm. People who surrender with their attorneys don't have to be handcuffed, and that's what's going on right now.
And Bob, as Aaron reported, it would appear from what we've learned that there is an elevator usually that the judges take, that the former president will take. It'll get him to that courtroom just a little bit quicker than perhaps a typical criminal defendant who'd have to head up the way everybody else does.
That's correct, David. And that area will be frozen. That used in special circumstances for other than judges. And that entire area will be frozen on the 15th floor. No other operations will be going on that day, just this until this is over. So this will happen very quickly, from what I understand. And he'll be arraigned in a short amount of time.
And Bob, you know this building better than any of us who are on the air together here today as a team. But when he gets upstairs, it's our understanding that there are cameras in the hallway that will capture sort of the history of the moment, a former president in the hallways walking toward that courtroom. But once inside the courtroom, the judge has decided overnight to decide in favor, if you will, of the Trump team, who had argued that this would create a circus-like atmosphere, that there will be still cameras in the courtroom just before the proceedings to capture the images, and then they will be taken out of court as well.
Sure, there are cameras schemed throughout the building, David. They're on the floors. They're also in the elevators. So at some point, he'll be under camera the entire event. Whether they'll be released, I cannot say. But again, in the courtroom, as I said, it would be just singular photographs, nothing more than that. So this is the time right now where he's being processed, and they'll go upstairs and they'll go through that process.
Bob Boyce, ABC News contributor, former NYPD chief of detectives, giving us somewhat of an image of what might be playing out right now. Bob, we sure do appreciate it. If you get any word, certainly raise your hand. We'll come back to you within a moment's notice here. John Carl, it is, you cannot underscore the unprecedented nature of what it is we're all looking at here today.
Absolutely. Although, interestingly, he's not the first president to be arrested.
Speeding, right?
Yes, speeding with a two-horse carriage, Ulysses S. Grant in 1872. But the arrest wasn't made public until almost 3 decades later, when the arresting officer gave an interview to a local paper. But yes, this is unprecedented to see. Again, I think what is maybe even more significant than a former president, also the leading candidate for the Republican presidential nomination. And if you just look at how this will play out when a trial may happen, you could really see a situation where you have a trial happening simultaneously with a presidential campaign.
Does this become his campaign in many ways?
There's no question. You saw this when he gave the first rally of his 2024 campaign in Waco, Texas, a site chosen for, in part, the symbolism of Waco and the showdown there with the Branch Davidians back in 1993. He, in that speech, spoke more about the investigations against him, about his own victimhood, as he was describing it, the FBI, the Department of Justice, partisan prosecutors in Georgia and in New York, and that was most of that speech, and that will be most of his campaign.
Part of that speech in Waco and in the days that followed have been these attacks against the DA, in this case, Alvin Bragg here in Manhattan, and against the judge, Juan Merchan. And this particular judge handled the investigation into the Trump family business. Mr. Weiselberg, there was a conviction in that case. And of course, we know he's familiar with the family. I'm just curious, Dan Abrams, you talked about this earlier, this intersection of politics and the law, and boy, is it stark today. From the political rhetoric that John Carl describes here to walking into that courtroom, how quickly does the temperature shift?
Well, Look, it's a totally different temperature, right? In the courtroom, everything is controlled. Politics is Donald Trump's arena, right? He lives and thrives on the public response, et cetera. The courtroom is totally different. It is controlled by the judge. The judge determines who moves when, who speaks when, et cetera. So that is, night and day from a political event than the legal event that you see inside a courtroom.
And what do you make of the judge in this case? What do we know about him? What will he tolerate?
So he knows a lot about Trump world. I mean, this is a judge who just presided over a case against the Trump organization. So he knows in very minute detail a lot about the finances that went on in the Trump organization. And in fact, this is a judge who had promised Alan Weisselberg a 5-month sentence and who said that at the end of the trial, that after everything he had heard in the case, that if he hadn't promised Weisselberg just 5 months, he would have given him more time. So this is someone who is not going to be coming into Trump world without any information about some of the backstory. Now, probably very different issues here than in that case. But you can imagine after that conviction, Alan Weisselberg pled guilty to 15 counts. The Trump organization found guilty on 17 counts. You can guess that Donald Trump is not going to like the fact that this is the same judge who is now presiding over his case, who presided over those cases as well.
There's been no indication that the judge will impose any sort of a gag order, but this has been part of the conversation in the public space, given the rhetoric that we have heard from Donald Trump, from fellow Republicans, from Trump supporters in the weeks and days leading up to this moment. Unlikely he'll impose that gag order unless he sees something along the way that alarms him?
Yeah, I think it's unlikely that in this case there would be a gag order. It's possible. We've seen it in other high-profile political cases. Roger Stone's case is a good example where Roger Stone kept violating the gag order and the judge kept getting mad at him and threatening him, et cetera. I don't expect that to happen here. Gag orders are very much in the discretion of the judge. Now, you talked before about a camera in court. Actually, in New York State, it's very unusual to have a camera. They vary state to state, but it would have been a particularly unusual event to have a camera in the courtroom in New York State.
Now, the judge did acknowledge the history of this moment in making his decision, but he decided, again, obviously agreeing with the Trump team on this one.
Right, and that is consistent with almost every other court in New York. Gag order, though, is really more within the discretion of the judge. There's less sort of history and precedent to look on and say, well, typically in the state of New York, we do this and this. A gag order is really going to be much more determined based on the facts, the nature of the crime, et cetera. But I don't expect that he's going to impose one because, one person who would not be happy about that at all would be Donald Trump.
But of course, Donald Trump's team.
Right, that's why.
How do you put a gag order on a presidential candidate?
Obviously very true. But he will be watching, this judge, no doubt, what Donald Trump says at Mar-a-Lago hours from now, later today, and in the weeks that come. And certainly Donald Trump's legal team has told the former president, you have to be aware that you're now a criminal defendant. Your words will matter.
Well, and he's also been attacking the judge already. I mean, that's where he's got to get a little bit careful, is that, you can attack the judge, okay. I think you can probably get away with attacking the judge. But if he starts, attacking others, if they get the name of a grand juror, or something happens that goes beyond the sort of typical name calling of a judge that you disagree with, that could lead to some sort of change with regard to a possible gag.
I want to bring in Sarah Isgur. Yeah. She wants in on this conversation. Obviously worked during the Trump years in the Attorney General's office. And Sarah, to John Carl's point, there are real challenges when it comes to political speech and free speech in this country and any notion of a gag order.
Right. I mean, I think that a judge could put a gag order, for instance, on the address of the prosecutor or the judge, things like that. But when you're talking about a gag order that you cannot criticize here, a government employee by a candidate for president of the United States, that is such core protected First Amendment speech. I think that would not be upheld by another judge on appeal.
Sarah, thank you. Kate, we're also learning more about who traveled down in this motorcade today, though in a separate vehicle.
That's what we're hearing. So 2 lawyers, Todd Blanche and Susan Neckles. Neckles was involved in the trial of the Trump Organization, so she is a known quantity, long-standing lawyer in this orbit. Blanche, brand new to this particular legal team, former federal prosecutor at the Southern District of New York. Interestingly, actually also the former office of current Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg. He too was a former federal prosecutor in that office. Don't know if they crossed paths, but this is a very seasoned former federal prosecutor, now defense attorney, who has now just joined the Trump team, and that seems like a significant development.
And if we could bring the Trump legal team image back up to the screen, I want to bring in Terry Moran on this, who has covered legal matters for many years as well. And Terry, this notion that in the last 24 to 48 hours, the adding of Todd Blanche, for example, to this legal team would seem to acknowledge on the part of the former president that this obviously is very serious what he's walking into, despite the political rhetoric, any kind of bravado going into this, that this moment becomes very real here this afternoon.
Very real, David, and very difficult. You're absolutely right. Facing criminal indictment for anyone, even a former president of the United States, perhaps especially a former president of the United States, is just a tremendous psychological, financial, personal burden, and he needs the best professional help. He also is running for president. He believes he was cheated out of the presidency. There's no evidence of that. He leads, since he came down that escalator, he changed American politics. He ignited a populist movement that is realigning our politics. He is the most dominant political figure in America, and he's got to use his political speech as well to advance that agenda. It is an incredibly difficult thing, especially for a man, let's face it, as undisciplined in his public speaking as Donald Trump has been. His lawyers have always had trouble managing him, but he has to handle both lines of his life right now. The fact that he's facing criminal indictment in this and perhaps future cases, and the fact that millions of Americans, remember 74 million people voted for him. They want him to be president again. There's just been nothing like it.
Terry Moran with us here this afternoon. And Terry, as you know, our team has been reporting that he faces, the former president, at least 24 separate counts here in this case. This indictment remains sealed perhaps until any moment now. How long will it take for the judge and in that courtroom to go over each one of these counts before we see the former president again? And how long before the rest of us know what's inside this indictment?
Well, we're told, of course, and Aaron Katersky has been reporting this, that it will be probably within minutes. It'll be emailed out as soon as it is presented to the defendant. And that's the judge's job. The judge's job right now is to make sure that Donald Trump, as he faces these very serious felony charges in the state of New York, understands them, understands his rights, and understands the process going forward. That will take some time. He's not going to let him, get out of the courtroom until the judge is certain that there's no reason for appeal out of this stage. He's got to make sure that all the defendant's rights are protected, and that Donald Trump goes forward from this courtroom understanding what he's up against in court.
Terry Moran with us from Washington this afternoon. Terry, thank you. Stick with us here. We're looking live right now at that hallway on the 15th floor. I had mentioned earlier that this is one of the few areas inside criminal court where there is a television camera, and this is the feed coming out of that hallway. Unclear whether or not the former president has been brought to the floor as of yet, or whether they are awaiting his arrival there. You see, presumably, members not only of the security there at the courthouse, but the Secret Service waiting, we believe, for the former president to come up and face the judge. And, of course, our team there in the hallway reporting this out. We'll know at any moment when the former president arrives. It's our understanding that, again, they're waiting for him, that he's undergoing processing in a different part of the building. And Aaron Katersky, he has officially surrendered, as any criminal defendant would, inside the building. And again, as we look at this live picture, Aaron, we now await the former president being brought upstairs in that elevator that is usually reserved for judges.
And what an extraordinary scene this is, David. I know we keep saying how unusual all of this is. It's not like this courthouse hasn't handled high-profile defendants. John Lennon's killer, Mark David Chapman, John Gotti, the mobster, made an appearance here. The football player, Plaxico Burress, Sean Puffy Combs, but never a former American president. And the entire hallway has been reconfigured. It has been off limits to us over the last couple of days while they try to configure all of the movements, so we haven't been able to see what the hallway looks like until now. And ordinarily there's more freedom of movement, but every other court proceeding on the 15th floor has been halted, and many cases in the building on some of the other upper floors have been adjourned just to reduce the number of people who are present while the former president is inside.
Very interesting as you look live, the photographer, a very good photographer, getting a white balance there off a sign on the doorway. We'll go right back to that camera as soon as it's back up and running, because that is the live picture of the hallway. Reporters have told me now that the former president has not arrived on the 15th floor, so that's why this camera will be important as far as offering us a window into what's playing out inside criminal court. I want to bring back in Bob Boyce, former NYPD chief of detectives. And Bob, again, you know this building well. Take us through what's playing out right now. The president on another floor, and once they're done with him, they'll bring him up to this hallway here?
They will, David. And that's what you see up there is the Secret Service standing in front of us, as well as court officers. NYPD is out of this by now. They're all outside. This is with the two agencies right now, Secret Service and court officers, and they have everything squared away. He'll come out of those elevators to our left and walk into the courtroom where those people are waiting for us. So we'll see him come out in a short amount of time and make his way with the elevator back into the court.
Bob Boyce with us here. We're at the mercy of the Zoom, as we all are fully aware of, but describing that this is, in fact, the hallway. The former president will emerge. We're going to stay trained on this view right here, because this could be the only thing we see of the former president until those still images from inside the courtroom are released later in the day. Pierre Thomas, as you look at this, Chief Justice correspondent, you see something very different from the legal world. On the other side of the anchor desk here, you see extraordinary security.
David, this reminds me of what you would see if there was a major terrorism suspect, where you were trying to protect the public and the courthouse itself. The number of law enforcement officials you see in that video there is just extraordinary. This is not the way a court typically operates. It would be a bevy of people moving in and around the building. The fact that the building has been essentially shut off from the rest of the public. This is just, as we said over and over again, extraordinary, unprecedented. And again, this is the kind of security you would see if there were a major terrorism suspect or crime boss in the courthouse.
And on the flip side, in this case, they're looking to protect a former president who now will face the judge as a criminal defendant. And John Carl?
And you know, Trump is familiar with this particular hallway because he watched Allen Weisselberg when he turned himself in and walked down that hallway, actually handcuffed. They actually handcuffed Weisselberg. And Weisselberg went through that trial, and just this past January, by this same judge, was sentenced to 5 months in prison.
And as Dan Abrams said earlier, when he got to the end of the evidence, the judge indicated to Weisselberg that had I known what I know now, that sentence would have been longer than the 5 months that Weisselberg received. Again, we'll, of course, stay on this live picture right here because we are expecting to see the former president at any moment. John Santucci, you have a bit of color for us?
Just a little bit, David. So far, I'm told the former president is going through processing. He is with the district attorney's investigators, as Aaron Katersky and others reported earlier. He's right now, David, only joined by one member of his legal team. It's a very small footprint with the former president, in addition to some Secret Service agents. As far as the rest of his legal team, and there are several, as you said earlier, that are with him for today, I'm told they are meeting with court staff right now, going through some logistics, some processing. They are waiting, David, to receive a copy of the indictment. I do not believe they've received it so far, according to my sources, but relatively shortly, I'm told the full legal team will join the former president, and very shortly, David, they will make that trip up to the 15th floor and head into that courtroom.
And it's your understanding, John, that it's Todd Blanche and Susan Necklace who were in that separate SUV who are now in this building with the former president?
I'm told all three, David, that we showed earlier to our viewers. Todd Blanche, Susan Necklace, and Joe Tacopina. They have become the three lawyers that are working very closely with the former president on this case. All three accompanied the former president down to that trip, and as we reported earlier, David, in a separate vehicle.
And there's no question, John, that behind the scenes, we've been talking about this juxtaposition of the political rhetoric and then the reality of being inside criminal court. There's no question that the former president understands the weight of what's playing out here.
Absolutely, David. I mean, even heading up last night from Florida, we know all the cameras trained on the plane. I'm told the former president was watching the coverage, and one of his aides used a strange word with me, which was melancholy. They said he was watching it. He wasn't enjoying the coverage. It was absolutely the weight of it hitting him, as we reported earlier here, David. He's been talking to many people and doing a phrase that I know John Carl has also heard Donald Trump does with people when he's not sure, and that is, what do you think of this? How is this playing? What's the coverage like? How is this going to move forward for me? And that is something Donald Trump does where, quite frankly, Donald Trump himself is not sure how this is going.
And you know, John, better than anyone, any of us who've ever interviewed the former president, and that's all of us here at this desk over the course of many years here. Those are the kinds of questions he'll ask us as reporters, too. How's this playing? What are the polls saying? What did you think of that speech last night? And even though we're reporters and we move on to the next question, he'll ask that kind of thing anyway. But I wanted to ask you, John Santucci, why the addition of Todd Blanche? We gather it's to beef up the legal team, but have the insiders within the Trump team explained to you that addition in the last 24 hours?
They've explained to me, David, that they needed a heavy hitter. They needed somebody that had dealt with a tough situation before. And as we reported here, Todd Blanche is one of the few lawyers that's still within the Trump orbit that went up against one of the toughest fights Donald Trump and his allies have had, and that is special counsel Robert Mueller. I'm told that within the last couple of days, Todd Blanche got a high marks, if you will, from a former client. And that was Paul Manafort, the former chairman of Donald Trump's 2016 presidential campaign. And Manafort had said in that conversation to Donald Trump, Todd Blanche was the one that made this better. And that is very clearly something that the president reacted to and recognizes right now, David, he needs someone that can make this situation just a little bit better.
Of course, Paul Manafort, the one-time chairman of the campaign, a convicted felon now, but defended by Mr. Blanche, who now will defend the former president, John.
And an indication of what you're saying is that Trump reaches out to everybody on this. He polls people. This is why anybody can be a senior advisor to Donald Trump. He asks his valet questions. He asks whoever is in the room. Another person he's been very much in touch with throughout this process is Steve Bannon, who, of course, was the chief strategist in the White House and a key figure in that first presidential campaign, but who left on terrible terms, Trump calling him sloppy Steve, facing his own legal troubles, but very much so somebody who has been advising Donald Trump. And Bannon's advice, as I understand it, is this is now your issue. Go out there, go on offense, go on attack, and make this the moment. It's the line you hear from Trump already, and you will hear over and over again. They're going after me because they really want to go after you. I am all that stands between them, this nebulous deep state or whatever you call it, and the people who have supported Donald Trump. That's the argument it's making, that he's going to be making.
Even more so now. And in fact, there were echoes of this early on before he even became president in 2016. But now, obviously, much louder given the fact that he's a criminal defendant here. As we come up on 2 o'clock in the East, I just want to bring our viewers up to speed. You're looking at a live picture inside criminal court. This is in Lower Manhattan. Former President Donald Trump down in the building in another location. He'll be brought up an elevator usually reserved for judges in that building. He'll be brought up by Secret Service, the NYPD, along with all 3 members of his legal team up to the 15th floor, where he'll then face the judge. He'll be arraigned on those charges. This indictment remains sealed at this hour. They will learn the charges first, obviously. ABC News has been reporting that sources have told us at least 24 charges, separate counts in this case. That number could could, of course, be higher. We're being very careful with our reporting and what exactly is in the indictment. Obviously, we simply do not know. There have been many who have asked, does Alvin Bragg, the DA in this case, have any surprises up his sleeve? This is an image of the former president leaving Trump Tower earlier today, a wave to the crowd, a fist bump to the crowd. It was very quick, and in fact, if you glanced away, you missed it. Then taken in the motorcade down to Lower Manhattan. There have been questions about whether or not he'd take Fifth Avenue here in New York. Anyone who's been to New York, or even if you haven't, you know Fifth Avenue, that's where Trump Tower is. They didn't take that route in the end. They went down the FDR, the highway that is just along the East River. With the motorcade, traffic cleared, pedestrians for the most part cleared all over the city. An extraordinary security presence that Pierre Thomas has been reporting on here this morning. Lindsay Davis reporting that those who had gathered outside Trump Tower today were in large part tourists who come to the city. And of course, Trump Tower has become a very familiar stop if you're a visitor in this city. Many of those tourists simply picking this perhaps Easter week with the holiday approaching to bring their family here to visit. And again, they won't forget their timing on this one, given what they've witnessed play out here in New York. The reason we have our camera trained on this particular location, for those of you who might just be joining us, is the fact that the former president will be brought upstairs to the 15th floor at any moment. He'll appear before Judge Juan Merchan here momentarily. That's when he'll learn of the charges. There had been some question about whether or not in the courtroom you would actually hear from former President Trump, not us, because there are no television cameras in court, but whether or not Donald Trump would speak himself. Catherine Falder is getting some indication that the former president does, in fact, plan to plead not guilty himself, not through his lawyers, but himself. And of course, we'll have to wait and see if that comes to fruition. There had also been some questions about whether or not Donald Trump would approach the cameras, take advantage of any opportunity as he got out of the motorcade in Lower Manhattan. Simply did not do that. And whether or not that was a decision made in the moment, we'll certainly report out as the day wears on. We do know that as of right now, there are plans for the former president to speak later today when he flies back to Florida to Mar-a-Lago to address reporters there in Florida. The hallway getting very quiet here. I don't know if that's an indication as to whether or not we could see the former president at any moment as he makes his way into that courtroom. And again, Dan Abrams, he'll face Judge Juan Merchan, who is very familiar with the former president and his family business, given the fact that he's presided over a case that gave very intimate details.
Yep, and we've talked about the fact that the ABC News reporting is that there will be, numerous counts here, right, over 24, et cetera. But that doesn't mean it's over 24 sort of incidents it's stemming from,
They
right?
can be very similar.
Correct. It could be numerous counts stemming from 1 or 2 incidents of falsifying a business record once on this, and then in a separate place, and then in another place, et cetera. And so that's where you could see the stacking of the charges with regard to each falsification potentially of a business record, even if they stem from the same incident or incidents.
And of course, there have also been questions about whether or not, and I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here, about whether or not this indictment would include misdemeanors and felonies. I know some outlets have gone ahead and reported, according to sources, that there will be some felony counts inside this indictment. We simply do not know for sure until we see what's in this indictment, and we will find out after the defendant learns what's in the indictment. And in this case, as we've been reporting out here, the history today is that defendant is a former president, something we simply have not seen before. What do you expect from the judge, Kate Shaw, as far as temperament, what he'll expect in that courtroom, and what he'll expect moving forward from this day?
I expect that sort of norms that govern in the courtroom, the norms of law and not politics or political rhetoric, will be expected. Everyone present will be expected to speak in the language of law and not of politics. And I expect the former president's legal team will understand that that is the sort of directive that the judge explicitly or implicitly will be sending them. And I imagine the former president, too, to the extent that he does speak himself, will also adhere to the norms of the courtroom. What happens outside of the courtroom later in his remarks or elsewhere, of course, a different story.
Which has always been the challenge, even with advisors in the White House with the former president. But there's no question in your mind that his legal team, particularly now that he's beefed up that legal team, that they've advised him of being very careful, particularly going into what we're looking at here today.
I presume that is right in terms of what happens in court. But of course, former President Trump seems to keep his own counsel in terms of the kinds of statements he makes, on the campaign trail and when he's speaking in a political register. But in court, I imagine the lawyers have been quite clear about what the expectations are.
David, just one other point on the beefing up of the legal team. It shows you he's taking this seriously, right? There's a sense, I think, among some that this is just a political thing, right? That Donald Trump is just using this, et cetera, and that he's sort of, has no real concerns about this. Adding a player like Todd Blanche onto this team of already having 2 lawyers makes it clear he knows this is serious. He knows he has to find the best legal representation he can get. And he needs to fight this not just in the court of public opinion, but in a court of law. And that's why hiring someone like Todd Blanche, who has an excellent reputation, is so significant in this context.
Again, he's been so successful for so many decades, not only in the political realm of the last decade or so, but even before that in the legal realm. And now both worlds collide. And so the question will be a real test of the former president's skill set, both in the courtroom and in the court of public opinion.
Because remember, a lot of the former president's legal skirmishes have been civil cases, right? They've all been mostly civil. And I say mostly because the Trump organization, even though he wasn't a defendant, was charged criminally, et cetera. In a civil case, you can always settle. You can always just say, I want to end this thing. I'll pay you this amount of money and let's make this thing go away. You can try to plead in a criminal case, but it's not as simple as in a civil case. You can resolve differences in a civil case. In a criminal case, it's a very different game. And so as a result, this is a new arena for him in the legal world as well.
As we look at this picture, though, we're reminded of what his attorneys have already said, which is there will be no plea deal in this case.
Right. He can't plead. I mean, this is, again, where politics intersects with the law, right? Which is that if this were just a legal case and there was no presidential campaign going on, could you see, let's plead to something, no jail time, et cetera, maybe we can work something out. There is no way, no how that Donald Trump can plead guilty to anything here. I mean, and this goes back to what John has been talking about this being a central tenet of his campaign. Can you imagine him pleading and then saying, well, we had to do it. There's just no way. I don't think that can happen. And that's not a legal analysis. That's politics meets the law.
Especially because he's facing multiple other criminal cases. So, I mean, he tries to plead away this one. He's got the Georgia case involving the election. He's got the 2 federal cases under the special counsel, Jack Smith. He's got a lot on his plate right now.
We should talk our audience through that, because that's really important here, is that as you're looking at this live picture, this is Lower Manhattan. Obviously, this is connected to the Stormy Daniels hush money payment. It's all stemming from that investigation. Again, we don't know what the charges are, but it stems from that payment just before the critical 2016 election, the work to keep her quiet. Initially, the former president saying he was unaware of that payment, then acknowledging it and saying there was nothing wrong with it. And again, hush money in and of itself isn't what is at issue here. It's whether or not the books reflected it in an accurate way, and then what the DA might try to connect that to. That's the big question here today as we wait the opening of this indictment. Now, what John Carl has just brought up is really significant for those of you watching this at home, because this is just the beginning of these legal tests that the former president is facing in the coming weeks and months ahead. Jack Smith, of course, the special counsel looking into the events leading up to January 6th. And the former president's role in those events. He's also looking into the classified documents discovered at Mar-a-Lago, and not just the classified documents, because we've seen President Biden, we've seen the former Vice President Mike Pence, but in this case, very significant because there are questions of obstruction, whether or not the former president worked in any way try to obstruct handing back those classified documents. They've begun to question members of the Secret Service, the valet, looking at the surveillance at Mar-a-Lago. And this is very significant. And John also alluded to Fulton County, Georgia, which, of course, was the alleged pressure that the former president placed on authorities there, saying, find me the votes, after having lost very closely to Joe Biden back in the last presidential election. It would appear there is some movement. Of course, we're going to stay trained on this doorway. There you see, Mr. Let's see, we'll wait until the legal team comes through that doorway. That'll be a real sign that the former president will be coming through in short order. But again, this is just the first of the legal challenges, Pierre Thomas, that this former president faces.
David, and before I get to that, I do want to say one thing about the prosecutor here, Mr. Bragg. He is under extraordinary scrutiny today as well. As we await these charges to be unsealed, there's a question, will this truly be a speaking indictment? I.e., will it lay out in great detail what the allegations are, what the charges are? Because some of the prosecutors, former and current, that I've talked to, have basically made the point. He's got to be able to explain this in a very clear way, and he's got to, in essence, say, I could not walk away from this without bringing charges.
Really interesting point that you bring up, Pierre. For those of you at home wondering what a speaking indictment is, you know, so often in these criminal cases, you'll get a rather straightforward indictment that just lists the counts, the charges. Now, in a case of this nature, given the history being made today, a lot of questions about whether Alvin Bragg will present what's called a speaking indictment, essentially lay out the story, lay out the case that the district attorney is trying to make here. And is there any question in your mind, Kate and Dan, whether or not this will be a speaking indictment?
You know, I presume that office, you know, has largely shifted to speaking indictments, particularly in a case like this. So I expect we're going to see a good amount of detail, narrative, not just this sort of bare bones kind of bullet point charges. I certainly hope so, because we are all hoping, and viewers are all hoping, to get a real sense of what the case will look like when the DA puts it on. And so I have to imagine that's informing the decision. So I do expect a speaking indictment.
I think that, in conjunction with the fact that he's already announced he's going to have a press conference afterwards, tells you that there's going to be information in there. I mean, this is not going to be the sort of thing where he's just going to say, okay, you know, this is the legal charges, et cetera, and we're not going to discuss it beyond that. He's going to hold a press conference. I'd expect there's going to be detail in the indictment as well that will explain exactly what they think that the president did, why it's a violation of the law, et cetera. And that's the key, right? It's not just the law, it's the facts, and how the facts relate to the law. And that's what a speaking indictment really does, is it doesn't just say a violation of this particular law, and here's the definition of the law. It explains why the facts in this case show that there was a violation.
He knows full well, this district attorney, that he is now, you know, target number one.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, politically, at least from the Republican side and those who support the former president. So either we go down the indictment and we try to report it out right here with your help, or the DA tries to help the public understand why he's come to this.
It's critical. I mean, look, there's a lot of questions. I have a lot of questions about this. He's got to help answer some of those questions, and I think the standard that Pierre talked about is a very fair one, which is to say it rose to the level of a case he couldn't walk away from. And that's got to be demonstrated, I think, in the context of the indictment.
And we should point out here that even though we have remained focused on this camera, there's not some delay here that we're watching unfold. It's still just 2:08. We had always believed that it was about 2:15 the arraignment would take place. So even if perhaps the former president's on the other side of that door, and he very well could be, you know, perhaps the judge is signaling we're going to do things the way we had scheduled to do things here. Aaron Kotursky just outside that building in Lower Manhattan Criminal Court. And Aaron, I know you are watching this on the monitor right here with the rest of us. Again, tell us what's playing out here inside this building. What will they have had to have done before they get to this point?
Well, in all likelihood, and they now seem to be moving people inside the courtroom, so I think we're close to the former president's arraignment. They would have processed him by now. That could mean fingerprints. He does not have to be photographed. A mugshot is not required for this kind of crime, so we're not sure whether his picture was actually taken. But customarily, any new criminal case is accompanied by fingerprints, so it's likely that the former president's prints were taken. We've seen a couple of members of the DA's squad. Those are the individuals who actually deal with the defendant personally, and I can see them going in and out of that area, that blackened door behind which is the elevator the former president will ride. I see there the chief of the court security officers in the cropped white hair and in the white shirt. And all of this movement indicates that the former president's arrival in court there on the 15th floor is imminent. The gentleman right in the middle in the purple tie is one of the spokesmen for the Office of Court Administration who helped coordinate some of the former president's movements. And there is District Attorney Alvin Bragg. The Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg has just been brought up the elevator as well. and entered the courtroom under heavy guard. David, the Manhattan DA, has endured a number of attacks, including a white powder that was sent to his office, along with a death threat that said, "Alvin, I'm going to kill you." Ever since then, he has been under immediate protection. His security detail has been expanded. So has the security around some of the key prosecutors involved in this case. And you could see him there entering court under the protection of officers, David.
No question, Aaron, thank you. A clear sign that this is about to get underway. We had just seen the Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg enter the courtroom on the 15th floor of the criminal court in Lower Manhattan. And as Aaron mentioned, under heavy security, not only to protect the former president, but to protect this DA who has taken incoming criticism, very heated criticism in recent days, not only from the former president's supporters, but from the former president himself, John Carl. Donald Trump saying that Alvin Bragg should be indicted.
He said he should indict himself. He said that late last night. He's also gone after Bragg's wife. It's been extraordinary, the vitriol with which he has gone after this man. He's called him an animal. He's gone after him in deeply personal terms, as he's also attacked the judge. This is Donald Trump's style. It's always been his style. We know how he went after Robert Mueller and Mueller's investigations. We know how he went after the Democrats who led the impeachment drive, both impeachment drives in the Congress, and the Republicans who joined in that second drive. But now, again, he's in a criminal process where he is not in total control anymore.
A trained fighter through his own life experience, political and business experience leading up to this moment. But again, John, he's never faced this kind of fight before.
Yeah, and you know, his mentor on such matters was the former the lawyer Roy Cohn, who taught him that what you do is you fight, you never acknowledge anything, you never concede anything. But another thing that Roy Cohn told him, and Trump has talked about this in recent days, with some of his confidants, is you don't get arrested because you lose control.
Aaron Katersky, who covers criminal cases for us often, very valuable to have him downtown today for us. And Aaron, as you look at this image, what does this tell you? And we believe the former president has been fingerprinted now. That's reportable?
Yes, we've just learned with the help of colleagues John Santucci and Catherine Falders that the former president has now been processed. That is now complete. That processing included the taking of his fingerprints. So that process is now complete. And any moment now it's expected he will be brought up the elevator there behind the closed, darkened doors to be escorted into court and arraigned on perhaps more than 24 felony charges. At that moment, the indictment will be unsealed, David, and we will finally get a look at the charges for ourselves. As part of the processing, the defense was given a courtesy copy of the indictment to review with Trump before he enters court so that he can knowledgeably enter his plea of not guilty, which his lawyer had already advertised he would do. But he will know exactly what he's pleading not guilty to from the moment he enters the room, David.
And Aaron, as someone who knows criminal court well, given your reporting for years, the layers of security represented in this live picture.
It's really extraordinary. I see Secret Service agents, I see court security officers, I see members of the DA's squad that would handle personal security for the district attorney and also deal with criminal defendants like former President Trump in this case. And they're just the ones that are on the 15th floor outside the courtroom. I've seen a number of officers, the bald gentleman in the foreground and the gentleman in the gray beard in the background who can be randomly assigned to any courtroom, but are frequently assigned to the courtroom of Judge Juan Merchan, the presiding judge in this case. And outside, David, there are 2 rows of court security officers in front of the building along a row of metal barricades. So this building is entirely locked down.
Aaron, thank you. As we stay trained on the 15th floor here, I want to bring in John Santucci because, John, as you heard Aaron report there, they now have the indictment in hand, the former president and his legal team. I presume they're reading it on their way up to the courtroom.
Yeah, David, our understanding is that once processing was completed, the Trump legal team would join the former president, would walk him through that. It is our understanding that process is happening right now. As Aaron just reported, processing was relatively quick. It did, as we reported from Aaron, Catherine, and I, include fingerprinting. We understand there was no mugshot taken of the former president, but now that process of reading through the charges. That will be the first time Trump and his team actually see what the charges are. As you've said, we've reported here, we are told it includes well over 24 counts. And now the question is, Donald Trump heading into court, and what is that about to look like, David?
And until this moment, John, had they been given any hint from the DA's office as to what was in that indictment, or simply nothing?
Nothing, David. If anything, the conversations over the last couple days have been described as pleasant logistic planning, according to my sources, and that is the extent of it. There has been no conversation as to what is in this document, if it includes felonies, if it includes misdemeanors. There's a lot of questions now, David, as to, quite frankly, what this is going to look like and, what's Trump's reaction to it. A lot of aides have been texting me that are not there, bracing, waiting to see what his reaction is going to be. As we reported here, he's been polling people over the last couple of days. What do you think this could look like? Donald Trump's one of the few people right now that knows.
And of course, the question, are there any surprises in this indictment? We know it stems from the Stormy Daniels hush money payment, but whether or not the former president himself will be surprised by anything therein.
Absolutely. And I think one of the other things that we've reported in the last couple of days, David, is that the DA's office, just towards the end, before the grand jury handed up this indictment, started to present evidence about another payment made by Donald Trump to another woman, Karen McDougal, that he had a relationship with around the same time as Stormy Daniels. It'll be curious, David, given the late word we got that became part of the district attorney's presentation to that grand jury, if there's anything about that case in this indictment, we're waiting to see.
John, thank you. John Santucci, who has reported on Donald Trump for years for us. I just want to pause here to listen in on the silence in this hallway, 15th floor criminal court in Lower Manhattan. Certainly every officer in that hallway, both from the NYPD, the Secret Service, the law enforcement that works for the courthouse, they know the heaviness of this moment too. And you do have to wonder, after so many legal tests and political tests over the years, if the American people in some way have become somewhat immune to sort of these new chapters in the Trump story. But I think our viewers know full well that whether you support him or not, that this is truly historic here.
David, having covered a number of court cases in my career, one thing strikes me every single time. When a defendant walks into the court and sees the judge, they are not in control. And this is a moment, one of the few moments where Donald Trump will walk into a room and he's not in control at all. And it always strikes me because you immediately want to put yourself in that defendant's position because you're looking at the judge and the judge is going to have enormous sway over what happens. And it's just a very profound moment for any person, be it former president or, the average everyday person.
The judge in this case, Juan Merchan, in that courtroom. We know the DA, Alvin Bragg, also in that courtroom as well. And John Carl, you and I both know from interviewing the former president many times through the years, the political bravado that the public sees, we also know the other side of him, which he'll acknowledge the reality of the moment along the way. And it's certain in this moment, from our own reporting, Catherine, John Santucci, describing him as melancholy in the last 24 hours, that he understands the gravity of this moment, too.
You can see it in those brief moments that we've seen him coming in and out of Trump Tower into the courthouse. He gave that brief kind of fist pump But you can tell, I think anyway, having followed him and known him for so long, the weight of the moment he undoubtedly feels. And I think that's why he hasn't done a lot of what they initially said he was going to do. I mean, there was talk of him having a big event at Trump Tower. I think I mentioned to you earlier, David, there was even talk of him riding down the escalator to go down to the lobby on the way to being arraigned, kind of reenacting the announcement of his 2016 presidential campaign. But there's been none of that. He's been, he has been quiet. He's getting in and out of New York as quickly as he possibly can. I'm sure we're going to see him, going all out tonight in Mar-a-Lago, and he's been doing his social media. I mean, he actually issued a social media post from that motorcade down to the courthouse, once again, attacking this judicial system.
And in fact, John, he said, heading to Lower Manhattan, the courthouse seems so surreal. Wow, they are going to arrest me. That was the message from former President Donald Trump on his way to court. Kate.
Yeah, and we've been using the term he's under arrest, and I think it's worth pausing for a second. I think we think of arrest as just involving handcuffs, but arrest means you're not free to leave, and he has not been free to leave. He is under arrest since he entered that courthouse.
A very different scenario from what he's used to here.
Absolutely. He's the most powerful person in most rooms. As John was just saying, he's going to walk, and Pierre, he's going to walk into that courtroom, and he is not the most powerful person, the judge, the DA, but certainly not former President Donald Trump.
I think just the facial expressions of the officers in this hallway say a lot, Dan.
Yeah, I mean, look, they know this is a big deal. And as you said, David, whether you support Donald Trump or you don't support Donald Trump is irrelevant, I think, for the purposes of the law enforcement that are there. They're there to do a job. They know it's an important one. They know this is a serious moment. They know that they have to take this seriously. They know that the cameras are focused on them. And so, I think that this is reflecting that. But then again, there is also something about this, and while this is very different from what happens every day in this courthouse, most people who aren't lawyers would know this courthouse from jury duty, and that's about it. But these are the same officers who are there. Many of them, they've obviously enhanced the number there, who work in these courtrooms every day, who work with the juries every day, and they're just there and doing their job.
They are doing their job. We saw a gentleman in the suit there and the pin, which gives it away to Secret Service, Pierre. Layers of law enforcement gathered throughout Manhattan today. The barricades, a couple of barricades deep outside the courthouse, outside Trump Tower. That is usually the case, though reinforced, obviously knowing that the former president was coming back to New York from Mar-a-Lago. Just the coverage in the last 24 hours on cable news, the live coverage of his plane taking off from Florida and then landing in New York. Surreal in nature, though reminiscent of other inflection points along the way in covering Donald Trump, his political career. And now it brings us here to criminal court in Lower Manhattan. Every time we hear one of those tones or those bells, we wonder, is it the elevator? Is it some sort of signal? Now, we do know that they had always intended to have this arraignment at about 2:15 Eastern here in New York. We know from Aaron, John, Catherine's reporting that the president has been fingerprinted, has been processed, booked like any other criminal defendant already. That what's transpired here in the interim is that the former president and his legal team have now been given the indictment. It's important to point out that they also had no hint, like the rest of us, waiting today to see what Alvin Bragg is going to present in this courtroom as far as the indictment against Donald Trump. They have not seen it until today. So this trip up to the 15th floor in this elevator that's been reserved for the former president will no doubt include, at some point along the way, a moment to read through this indictment, to digest what they will be in that courtroom to face. And Terry Moran, this notion that once you walk into a courtroom and you're before the judge, there's nothing more stark than that moment when you realize the judge is now in control.
Absolutely. Having spent a lot of time in courtrooms covering trials, as Dan did as well, that is an ominous moment for anyone in the position of Donald Trump, and we should spare a thought right now for the many, many thousands of Americans who aren't famous, who have come within the grip of the long arm of the law, justly, maybe some unjustly. Donald Trump now as well. And I always thought covering trials, going into courthouses around the country, that I was lucky to be a reporter because you always see people having the worst day of their lives. they're under arrest, or they're family members of those who are under arrest. They're facing just an ordeal, one that they may well have brought on justly on themselves because of their conduct. But this is a personal drama that even someone as defiant and public is as strong as Donald Trump has been in the face of all kinds of impeachments and civil cases and accusations and getting caught red-handed on tape doing things. This is different.
Enormous pressure on the former president, who's now running for president for a third time. But Terry, also unspeakable pressure on this district attorney. There are a lot of people in this country who want to know why this indictment and why now.
Absolutely. And in fairness, and to be straightforward, this is a highly unusual prosecution in its process. This district attorney ran for office. He asked voters to support him because he communicated to them that he was the kind of person who had what it takes to get Donald Trump. He boasted that he'd sued the Trump organization, Donald Trump, before in a previous capacity. He said he would hold Donald Trump accountable. He politicized the investigation. When he got to office, he did halt the investigation that was then underway in that office, the Manhattan District Attorney's office. He decided to do away with that one, which looked at whether Donald Trump had inflated his assets. And then he reached back 6 years to resurrect the Stormy Daniels case that his predecessor had declined to prosecute, that federal prosecutors had declined to prosecute. This is a highly unusual course, and it does, for supporters of Donald Trump and for others who see the way the law usually works, bring to mind the words of the great Justice Robert Jackson, who said prosecutors should choose their cases. They should not choose their defendants.
And that is why many who know Alvin Bragg in this in the legal world have said he knows the stakes here too, and a lot of questions about what the public will learn and what the former president has already learned about what's inside this indictment. Our team now reporting that the former president is on his way upstairs inside this building. Of course, forgive me for repeating for those of us who have been out there watching and with us every step of the way here, but again, for those just joining, we're coming up on 2:30 here in the East. The former president in Lower Manhattan. This is criminal court. You're looking at the 15th floor. The former president will be brought up through an elevator, again, usually reserved for the judges. He is being accompanied by his 3 attorneys, the addition of one more attorney just in the last 24 hours, Todd Blanche, a signal that the former president is taking this very seriously. They will appear before Judge Juan Merchan in that courtroom. There had been questions about whether or not there would be cameras in the court, broadcast cameras. The Trump legal team fighting in the last 24 hours, making the case before the judge that would create a circus-like atmosphere. So no cameras. There's the legal team right there. The 3 members of former President Donald Trump's legal team entering the courtroom. And obviously, it would signal that soon after the former president will enter that courtroom as well. We already saw Alvin Bragg, the DA in this case, enter the courtroom about 15 minutes ago. Before them, they're now in the courtroom themselves. They have briefed their client, I would presume, on the indictment, given our reporting that after he was booked, the former president, and here he is.
President Trump, will you come speak to us, President Trump?
There it is, about 5 seconds, but 5 seconds of history in this country. The first time we have ever seen a president, former or current, criminally charged. We know he's already been booked. He is a criminal defendant entering a courtroom in Lower Manhattan, John.
And that did not look like somebody that was celebrating a moment that he would be able to capitalize for his campaign, as some of his people have suggested. This is the thing that seals his Republican nomination because it unifies Republicans against the prosecutor. He looked like a man very unhappy to be there. He was with his legal team, the 3 lawyers you mentioned, but also Boris Epstein, one of his close advisors, and I saw Jason Miller follow on. So he's got the legal team there, and he also has his political team. But this was not somebody that was looking to make a big scene at the courthouse, as they had suggested previously.
But he did look to me as someone very aware that the cameras were trained on him.
He looked right at the camera. One thing Donald Trump always knows And whatever room he is in is where the camera is. And he looked right at the camera, glared at the camera, and he walked into the courthouse.
There is something different, though, and this goes back to something we've been talking about up to this point, which is there's something different about walking into a courthouse. There is. There's just a different feeling that even if, when he gets back to Mar-a-Lago, he starts, going back to much of the rhetoric that he's issued about this DA, et cetera, when you're in the courthouse, particularly in a courtroom, but even in the courthouse itself, there is a sort of somber sense in the, it's not a happy place. Most people don't like being there. You don't go to a courthouse typically because you want to be there. And so there is that feeling, and this is a dreary courthouse. And so, I do think that we may see a very different Donald Trump tonight at Mar-a-Lago than we're seeing inside that courthouse right now.
I also, look at the sternness of the faces of these officers. And, Dan, you mentioned it. For those of us who have answered the call for jury duty, you understand that day in and day out, they work these cases. They protect the people of New York. They're in this courthouse. That is their job. They take it very seriously. And you didn't see, there wasn't even a moment that was excitable there. Everyone recognized the heaviness of the moment. It wasn't just the former president who looked stern walking in, but the officers, too.
But that's the case really with any criminal case, right? And this is, again, a difference between civil and criminal, but particularly in criminal cases. People in the courtrooms are serious. It's serious stuff. You're talking about the possibility of taking away someone's freedom. You don't take that lightly in any courtroom.
Definitely, but I do think it's true that in the hallways, they don't usually feel like that. The hallways are places where people are relaxed, there's conversation and crosstalk happening. You saw none of that. Everyone is taking this deadly seriously and correctly. So not just in the courtroom, I don't think, but in the surrounding areas as well.
And when we dipped in for a couple of moments there some time back, just to hear the ambient noise or lack thereof, I thought that spoke volumes too, Pierre, that you could hear a pin drop in that hallway for a good 25 minutes to, a half an hour before he even arrived.
David, the law enforcement officials and those officers in particular are mindful of the moment. They're there to protect the former president of the United States. They're there to protect the prosecutor. They're there to protect all involved. And they want to project the image of this is what we do. We're deadly serious about it. And one thing I can tell you, courthouses are rarely places of joy. And I think any defendant who walks into the courthouse, and we just saw the former president, that feeling cloaks you as you walk in.
So as we await here, about 2:30 here in the East, the former president now in the courtroom to face the charges, though he was given a preview, if you will, of the indictment that will be revealed officially in court. Prosecutors giving the former president and his legal team the indictment that includes the 24 or more separate counts. And again, as we pointed out multiple times here, those counts could be very similar in nature. We'll wait to see this before we take it any further. And as we await to hear what specifically is in that indictment, I do want to bring in ABC News contributor, former Governor Chris Christie, former prosecutor, former friend of the president, and potential opponent. I know that you're mulling over whether or not you'll run for president. We'll put that off until another day. I'm curious, Chris, though, what you make of that moment watching the former president walk into that courtroom.
Well, look, I think everything that everyone has previously said, Pierre and Dan and others, is accurate. I would give you a little insight from the 7 years I was U.S. attorney. I was friends with Donald Trump during those years, and he was fascinated by the cases that I brought. And I would get notes from him on a regular basis on newspaper clips about indictments that we had brought or convictions that we had gotten. And he was always very, very interested in what the criminal process was like, cheering me on when I would bring charges against people, when I would get convictions. And this was somebody who is not unacquainted with this process, even though this is his first time as a defendant. He was interested in it. He would ask me lots of questions about it. He had lots of opinions about it. And so I think it's probably a surreal moment for him that for all the rest of his life, he was doing this as an observer. And today, he is the participant. He's the person who is being charged, being fingerprinted. And he used to ask about that process as well. How does that work? What happens when they get surrendered to the FBI? So I know that he has thought a lot about this over the years in the context of other people. But for him to be going through this today, I don't care what his staff says, this is a very, very difficult day for Donald Trump.
And Chris, what do you make of the fact that, and you know him well, that he has been so successful over the years at pushing back the law, if you will, defending himself, delaying, stalling, and obviously there could be delays after this day. We fully expect them as we watch this case unfold. But the fact that he would be booked, fingerprinted, brought upstairs to the 15th floor there now, and is a criminal defendant in front of the judge as we speak.
Well, David, look, two different contexts, right? He's been extraordinarily successful, as Dan had mentioned earlier, on the civil side of things. And civil, by its very nature, is a little more collegial often, a little less serious, and a little more prone to delay. There is a right to a speedy trial in the Constitution. And so prosecutors are always under pressure, try to move as quickly as possible, and judges don't let defendants normally do anything that creates undue delay. So I think his normal practice that he's been successful at on the civil side will have much less success on the criminal side of things. He may have some, but much less success. And in addition, what we're talking about here is something that he has worked hard his entire life to avoid by the way he conducts his business. No emails, no text messages. When he speaks to you about business, he speaks in a kind of code language where you don't always know exactly what he's saying, but you kind of get a feeling for what he's implying. He's done all that because I think Roy Cohn taught him to do that, not to have any paper trail. And so this is going to be interesting to see what's in the indictment, what documents they have. I can guarantee you this much. They're not from Donald Trump. I never got an email from him in the 22 years I've known him. Never got a text message from him in the 22 years I've known him. He just doesn't do it.
So fascinating, Chris, when you describe those notes on newspaper clippings, and we've heard that anecdote from so many people who have interacted with Donald Trump over the years. I just got to ask you before I let you go, and I know you're going to be with us throughout the afternoon here, but before we let you go this time, if you think your one-time friend ever thought that he, after writing those notes to you, congratulating you on indictments through the years, if he would ever find himself in this position?
No, I don't think he ever thought he would, because I think he thought he was too clever to ever wind up in this situation. Too clever, too careful, too smart to ever wind up in this situation. And so I think there are two things going through his head today. Of course, as everyone has said, the political thoughts of, well, you know, I could make this okay for myself, I could fight. But there is also, I think, the overwhelming thought going through his mind right now is, how the hell did I get here? How did this happen to me? And how am I going to get out of it?
Former Governor Chris Christie, former prosecutor himself. Chris, thank you. Always appreciate the context that you bring to the conversation. I want to bring back in John Santucci, who has been reporting out inside Trump world these last 24 hours. And John, you were describing last night at Trump Tower, huddled with his attorneys, his beefed up legal team, if you will, that solitary ride in the motorcade by himself with the Secret Service on the way to Lower Manhattan down the FDR along the East River. Part of the city that you and I know very well, and certainly the former president does, native New Yorker, and to find himself inside this courtroom. What are you learning from Trump world so far as to his mood, his temperament on this day going through this, and what more can you share with our audience about what he might be thinking as he now enters that courtroom?
David, I have to tell you, as we were all reacting in real time, aides, people close to him for many years text me, people that don't even work for Donald Trump anymore, saying, wow, just that visual, that reaction of him coming through the door. As one person just wrote to me, he's really mad. Like, I've never seen him that mad, that stone cold face. He kept with tradition, as John Carl noted, he found the camera, but Donald Trump looked just almost frozen in this moment. I really do think, Dan touched on this earlier, and it's true, you know, just being in that building, it weighs on him. It weighs on him being back in New York City. You know, Donald Trump, you know, wanted to spend the rest of his life at Trump Tower. He's hardly up here anymore. And as I reported earlier, a melancholy mood, David, though he is upbeat, the fact that he is there by himself right now is just shocking. And to see that image that's on the screen right now of Trump sitting at court, flanked by his legal team, just looking over, I don't even think Donald Trump believes he's here in this moment.
What you are looking at are, thanks to you, John, the first image from inside the courtroom. We had been told there would be still photographers in court to capture images before the proceeding began. And in true form, John, as you had mentioned earlier, I mean, look, the former president finding the lens even in this particular moment. It doesn't take us to point out that he doesn't look like a happy man in these images. Obviously, he knows the weight of what he's going through in this moment, flanked by his legal team. But again, to see him looking at the lens, taking it on straight on.
His eyes locked on the camera, just as it was locked on the video camera as he walked in that hallway, just as it was when he walked into Trump Tower last night. He knows that these images will become defining images of Trump's career, of Trump's life, of Trump's political career. I mean, it's extraordinary. I see the anger. I see what John Santucci's referring to there, but it's not just anger. There's a weight. There's a sadness. I kind of think the last time I saw him look remotely like that was the moment that he got back into the White House after his rally during COVID at Tulsa, when it was the one rally where nobody showed up, and he walked out of Marine One. He had a red "Make America Great" hat scrunched up in his hand, his tie undone, and he looked like a defeated man. That looks like an angry Donald Trump, and it looks a bit like a defeated Donald Trump.
In the foreground, closest to us there in the photograph, is Todd Blanche. This is the lawyer added in just the last 24 hours. And the significance of that move, Kate?
I think it's right. They're taking this very seriously. So Trump already had several lawyers, right, experienced lawyers he brought on, this high-powered former federal prosecutor. Seems to me they're taking these charges extremely seriously, whatever the rhetoric suggests. And you can see that, of course, in these images. I mean, one thing I thought of is a line from an opinion out of the Supreme Court a couple of years ago where Trump was actually trying to fight Bragg's predecessor, Cy Vance, getting some documents, financial records. Supreme Court rejected Trump's efforts and said, a king is born to power and can do no wrong. The president is of the people and subject to the law. So even the president is subject to the law. Certainly an ex-president is, and you can really see that in these images.
And I think you're going to see different roles for the different lawyers in this case. Joe Tacopina, who you see there the furthest in the picture, is very close with the family of Donald Trump, with Kimberly Guilfoyle and Don Jr. And I think that that's how he was initially brought into this case. And I think now you're seeing Todd Blanche being brought in to be maybe the lead sort of legal voice on this. Joe Tacopina has been on TV.
The public face.
The public face, right. He's been fighting back. He knows the words Donald Trump wants him to use on television. He knows the message that Donald Trump wants to convey. But that's different than what you argue in court. I mean, we saw, for example, in the 2020 election legal arguments, Rudy Giuliani sometimes would argue one thing in court and then come outside of court and say something very different. Here, at least, you have different lawyers who can take on different roles in the Donald Trump defense. And again, this comes back to the intersection of politics and the law, which is some of the lawyers, Joe Tacopina, can maybe be the face of the team, can be out there, can be defiant, can be battling it out for Donald Trump. And yet inside court, you'll have different lawyers making very strictly legalistic arguments.
I think that in and of itself underscores the argument most of all that he's taking this seriously.
Yeah.
As you pointed out, Rudy Giuliani played both roles along the way in so many of these moments. In this case, you have the public face to the right there on the screen, and then the two attorneys on the left, Susan Nicholas, obviously, and then the lawyer added, Todd Blanche, in the last 24 hours. They are on President Trump's right-hand side, the former president, our left-hand side. And it's your belief moving forward that we'll see a lot of Mr. Tacopina, perhaps on Good Morning America and on other programs, but the two on the left will be making legal arguments almost immediately. We've heard, almost immediately there'll be motions to dismiss, if you will, to delay. That will be the work that they get working on immediately.
I think so. I mean, look, Joe Tacopina would tell you he can make these legal arguments himself and that he's perfectly qualified, et cetera. But I think that, there's a reason you bring on another lawyer like Blanche, who just left his law firm to come to this case. I mean, he's literally quit his job to come take on the case of Donald Trump. And, that means that, A, I'm sure he's been paid up front. B, I'm sure it means that he's, recognizes this is an interesting, important case. But C, and we've seen this in some of the other cases with Donald Trump, right? We saw in the Florida case where he had hired an election case in a very serious lawyer down there to take on the case. And look, and there's an intersection between these lawyers. They have to get along.
They do.
you know, they've got to figure out how to work together. And sometimes that doesn't happen.
And there's already been reporting about tension within the legal world. We'll let that come on its own in the coming days. Here's another image I wanted to show the audience watching with us here this afternoon, the officers in the courtroom. When you widen out, really, it's sort of, you know, underscores the moment. This is the kind of courtroom scene that those of us who have served jury duty or who have covered these criminal cases in the past, certainly you, Pierre Thomas, this is your beat. When you see the broader picture here, this spells out exactly what's playing out, that we're looking at a former president who is a criminal defendant here.
Exactly. You have layers upon layers of security. And I do think that as we watch this case unfold, what everyone is thinking about, including, I'm sure, Donald Trump and his legal team, is you do not want this to get to a trial. If you can get it dismissed, that's what you want to have happen. The reason being is if it gets to a trial, then it suddenly is in the hands of a jury. And it will be based on the presentation in court and the set of facts that the prosecution can present. So this beginning of the process gives you a hint of what's to come. It's a very somber moment. Those law enforcement officials, look at their faces. This is about business. And when you're in court, that's the thing that often strikes you, David, is that there's a certain amount of protocol, and the fact that once the train starts down the track, it started, and there's nothing you can do about it until it's resolved.
There had also been questions about what Judge Juan Merchan would expect in his courtroom. And just from the first initial images here, you know, there's no question that everybody involved in this environment right here is taking this seriously.
The president may have tweeted on his way there, but I can guarantee you he will show that judge respect in the courtroom.
Pierre Thomas, our Chief Justice Correspondent. Pierre, thank you. I wanted to ask Aaron Katursky, who's just outside the courthouse, and we'll stick with these images here because it is what we have, and we knew that this would be the story until we learn more from this indictment. Aaron, it's your understanding that the president was in fact fingerprinted, but no mugshot, and obviously we can see no handcuffs?
No handcuffs, but David, this image indicates that he is not a free man at this stage. He was placed under arrest, and as much as the court officers are there for his protection, it is also indicative when officers stand behind a criminal defendant that he is not free to leave. In fact, he will not be free to leave until a judge releases him, likely on his own recognizance. This is not a bail-eligible crime that he's going to be charged with and plead not guilty to. But he is not free to go until the judge says he's free to go. So those court officers are there both for his own protection and as I think, a vivid symbol of his predicament right now, David.
Aaron, what's your understanding as to how quickly the rest of us will learn what's in this indictment?
It should come at any moment as soon as the proceeding is complete. And our best indication that it was underway is the release of these images, because the photographers that were allowed in to snap photos were only allowed while the judge was not on the bench. So as soon as those photographers were escorted out and were able to show us these pictures, that means the judge is on the bench and the proceeding by now well underway. All the former president has to do is enter his not guilty plea. There may be some housekeeping matters, another date set for a status conference or a motion schedule, and then the judge will formally conclude the proceeding. I'm also struck by one other element in this photo, David. Behind the officers, you would normally see spectators in that first row. I was told that those first row, even two, would be kept empty as something of a buffer between the spectators gallery and the former president as yet another measure of security. So those members of the public and the press that were allowed in are in the back of the courtroom.
And perhaps, Aaron, you could speak to some of the irony here. As we can hear the helicopters hovering overhead, we hear the ambient noise there above you. But some of the irony here that it was Donald Trump's team, and we know this is a former president who has embraced the power of the lens, the power of television all these years as a businessman and then obviously as president of the United States, that it was his team that argued in the 11th hour that allowing cameras into that courtroom, television cameras, would create a circus-like atmosphere. They made a convincing argument. The judge agreed with them, which is why we're seeing these still photos instead. This was expected, but that it was the former president's team that argued to have it this way instead of video cameras that we might have seen in another instance.
The presumption in New York courts, David, is always that cameras are not allowed. Occasionally, a judge will allow a video camera in for just a few moments to capture a few frames of video, but rarely are proceedings like this actually televised, certainly not live, and certainly not wall-to-wall like this. So it wasn't a surprise, but it was the former president's attorneys who said that putting cameras in that courtroom would create not only a circus-like atmosphere, but also would be an infringement on the former president's presumption of innocence. And yet, for all of the talk of circus, out here there are a few hundred protesters mingled in with the curiosity seekers. And the former president seems to have caused some of that circus-like atmosphere by lashing out at the prosecutors and the judge in the case.
It is now 2:50 here in the East, 10 minutes before 3 o'clock in the East, and the breaking headline at this hour, just in, the former president has pleaded not guilty to the indictment that has been presented in that courtroom, the 15th floor of criminal court in Lower Manhattan. It's our understanding that he planned on making this plea himself and not through his lawyers. And John Santucci, what have you learned?
David, I'm told by a source in the courtroom the former president entered a plea of not guilty. We understand that they are going through the indictment right now. I don't have a readout on that just yet. But as that visual showed, the source telling me the former president sitting there listening quite intently right now, David.
It's your understanding so far, John, that it was the president, the former president himself, who entered the plea?
That I do not have clarity on, David. I'm working on that. I will keep you updated.
We'll see if that bears out. That was an indication given earlier. And again, as John points out, this would be a very strong indication, Kate and Dan, that we're going to soon know what's in this indictment, the fact that he's pleaded not guilty.
Yeah, and look, it's going to take them a little time to go through the indictment. If it is, dozens of counts, although if it is redundant and it may sort of reflect exactly the same language in a lot of the counts, just a little bit of a different fact as to which record, et cetera. So we don't know exactly, how detailed or complicated the indictment is going to be. But yes, I would expect that we should be getting this very soon. They have it now. They've reviewed it. He's pled not guilty, and this is the time for them to release it. It's going to be released electronically, so there's no, it's not like they're literally need to walk out of the courthouse to deliver it to somebody. They've got it there, and they just have to decide when to release it.
Dan, what do we see after this? I mean, take us through what the American public will see. They'll enter the plea. They'll leave the courthouse. They'll head back to Mar-a-Lago. The rest of us will start reporting out what's inside this indictment. But where does the case go from here? This is just the very beginning.
Yeah, this is going to take a while. I mean, the first thing is going to be, there are going to be motions, right? There are going to be efforts by the defense in particular to dismiss the case, to limit the charges. If there are felonies, to say the felonies should go away. There's going to be a whole list of arguments that the defense is going to make about why the indictment should fail.
Are we looking at months, more than a year here?
Oh, yeah. The entire process, I would expect, is going to take more than a year. But that is going to be largely in the hands of the defendant. That is largely in the hands of Donald Trump. Remember, there's a right to a speedy trial. If the defendant wants to move a case quickly, a defendant can move a case quickly. That's not really up to the prosecutor. Now, there are certain things that can happen that are beyond a defendant's control, new evidence, whatever it is. But typically, it is up to the defendant to decide how quickly do we move this forward to trial. I would expect that Donald Trump is going to want to wait, that there is going to be no rush on his part to move forward with this. I think there probably will be a rush to get out some of his motions, right? To say that this is a faulty indictment, that there shouldn't be any felonies here, that there's no crime committed, et cetera. That I think he's going to want out quickly. But when it comes to actually going to trial, I think we're probably well over a year away.
And that becomes part of the political calculation, obviously.
Right, yeah.
I think that's right. I would say at least a year. And in terms of kind of the early responses by Trump's defense team, I think we'll learn a lot about their strategy through their sort of early responses. If they move to dismiss these charges on the basis that this is, as Tacopina has been sort of alluding to in interviews, that this is a political persecution, that this whole case is flawed for that reason, that I think inject some of the political rhetoric into this legal conversation. If instead they say things like the statute of limitations has already run, this was 7 years ago, probably it's a 5-year statute, they're going to have to figure out how to finesse that. The prosecutors they may do it by saying the statute was paused while Trump was out of New York, of course being the president in D.C. So there could be legal arguments, there could be more politically inflected arguments, there could be a combination. But I do think they're going to move quickly to try to shape the narrative that will give us some real clues about their larger strategy.
For people at home watching and they hear this notion of motion to dismiss, what are the chances of that happening?
It's unlikely, but there are some real arguments. Look, we haven't seen the indictment yet. We need to see exactly what it is to know how strong the arguments may not be. I think once Kate and I get a chance to actually review what exactly they're alleging, immediately we'll be able to think about, okay, what could they argue as a defense attorney to eliminate the charges? But if there are felony counts here, and it is in connection with falsification of business records, there is going to be an immediate and serious argument that the felony counts shouldn't apply. We're going to have to see what is it that the prosecution is arguing that allows the misdemeanor to rise to the level of a felony.
I have a million questions for you on that, but I'm going to wait until we see what's in the indictment. Yeah, because this could go in a multitude of directions. I wanted to tell the viewers at home what they're looking at. Beneath me there on the screen, that's, I gather, Mark Burstein, that's the hallway there on the 15th floor. Yeah, these are the live pictures, and we will see the president one more time when he leaves the courtroom after they list the charges, the counts in this indictment. As Dan Abrams has been saying here, there's a good chance that many of these counts are very similar in nature. Again, we simply don't know. That is widespread speculation. Multiple outlets suggesting that will be the case today. We are eager to get the indictment. We should have it shortly thereafter. We do know that as you look at this, that the former president was given this indictment, but not long before he entered that courtroom. He was brought into the building. He was booked, fingerprinted, and as Aaron Kotursky said, no handcuffs, no mugshot, even though mugshots really aren't used in New York State anyway. There had been many questions about whether or not that would happen with the former president. A lot of the argument was he's one of the most, if not the most famous face in the world at this point. Why would you need one? He's now in that courtroom, though. The charges are being listed. They're being explained. He's entered a not guilty plea. John Santucci reporting that out. What we don't know is whether or not he entered that plea himself, though there was a suggestion early on that he would. Flanked by his expanded legal team, we know that the lawyer to the left there on the screen added in the last 24 hours a real signal that the former president recognizes what he's up against, whether or not you believe in the merits of this case or not, that he's not going to chance it, that these three attorneys will be the faces, and perhaps there will be, tweaks along the way of the legal team. We have seen that before, haven't we, John?
We've seen all kinds of churn in this legal team. I just want to make one point about what Kate and Dan said about this likely taking a year to get to trial. Just put that against the political calendar. About a year from the day before yesterday is going to be the Wisconsin primary, which would have followed probably enough primaries to clinch a Republican nominee. The Republican convention is about 15 and a half months from now. So if you have a trial that starts in roughly a year, depending on how it plays out, you could have a jury deliberating on the eve of a Republican convention. I mean, this is playing out against a political calendar, and it's not the only criminal case that will be.
Just extraordinary, John, when you think about it in those terms. It's also fascinating to watch this unfold, and I use that word carefully, when you think about the Republican opponents that he will face in this primary process. Obviously, Ron DeSantis hasn't declared, but very much looks and acts like a presidential candidate. But he, Nikki Haley, Mike Pence, with the exception of the governor you interviewed in the recent days, Asa Hutchinson, everyone else, though, is rallying around the man they would like to beat for the nomination.
What he's done is he's forced his potential opponents and some of his actual opponents to come out and defend him on this case. Now, not everybody's going to do it. You mentioned Asa Hutchinson. I mean, we'll see what happens with Chris Christie, who was just on, with us. If he ends up running, he's also been quite calling this a serious case. But look, we see Republicans by and large, coming to Donald Trump's defense. The only statement I've seen so far since he walked into that courtroom has been from the number 3 Republican in the House. And she has come out, Elise Stefanik, and she has attacked the judge, attacked this process, and put it directly in the context of the presidential campaign, saying that Donald Trump will defeat this the way he defeated the impeachments, the way he's defeated other investigations, and he will get elected president in 2024. That's the number 3 Republican in the House using this as an opportunity, not just to defend Donald Trump against these allegations, but also to put it in the context of the presidential campaign.
John Carl on the political implications and the race for the White House, which we cannot forget is well underway. I want to bring in John Santucci, who has some initial reporting on the counts. We don't know if this is all of them, but John, what have you learned so far?
David, so far we have that this indictment includes 34 counts. They are 34 counts that are felonies, David, and they are falsifying business records. That indictment just unsealed in criminal court. Obviously, no one coming out just yet from those proceedings. They are still ongoing. But as we reported just a few moments ago, David, our understanding is that the former president has pleaded not guilty to all of those counts, David.
All right, so you've heard that from John Santucci. He's reporting 34 felony counts falsifying records. For those of us who aren't lawyers, what does that mean, Dan Abrams?
Well, that's what we expected, right? We expected that the charge was for falsifying the business records, and this relates to the hush money payments. This was that the hush money payments were categorized as legal fees. And Michael Cohen has made it clear, and whether you believe Michael Cohen or not, the prosecutors will say that they have other evidence that supports it, that this was a payment made to, I think prosecutors will argue, to help his campaign. We'll have to see exactly what the felony enhancement is for. But that the reason you can elevate it from a misdemeanor to a felony is by saying that the falsification of the business records was done in an effort to conceal another crime. And the question then becomes, what is the other crime that they were concealing? It's basically saying, if you're going to falsify business records, it makes it worse when you're falsifying the business records to try to hide another crime. And that's what rises it to the level of a felony.
And what we don't know at this point is what Alvin Bragg will argue is the other crime.
Right. We think it's going to be campaign-related, but it could be something else. And Kate and I were talking about this, that it could actually be one of the uncharged crimes, right?
Right. So this could be a state campaign finance law. It could be something else. It could be still potentially a tax crime, right, or some other kind of business offense. It doesn't sound like that from the sort of initial responses to this indictment, but we just don't know. But there needs to be something other than just the falsifying of business records, because standing alone, those are misdemeanors. And it sounds like this plea was entered in response to felony charges.
So initially, if I'm cutting through what you're saying, initially it would seem Alvin Bragg is trying to connect the falsification of these records to impacting a campaign.
In an effort, right, potentially that the falsification of the business records was done so that he could help his campaign.
Exactly.
That, and in an improper and illegal way.
And that's a test. That's a real test for a prosecutor.
And it's tough. We've seen other cases. These campaign finance cases are not easy to win. We saw this in the case of John Edwards. It was a different case, different fact pattern. But in that case, John Edwards had paid, a woman had been paid off on behalf of John Edwards. And the claim there was that that was effectively a campaign donation. And John Edwards went to trial, and the jury hung on most of the counts. And they didn't bring the case again because it's too hard to prove that it's just about impacting the campaign as opposed to paying hush money to prevent either your wife or others from finding out about it.
And since we know how difficult it is, I want to bring in Terry Moran on this, because Alvin Bragg certainly knows that in that previous case, which isn't exactly the same thing, it was difficult, it was thrown out. And so to move forward, some in the legal world are speculating that Alvin Bragg is more convinced given what he has here.
He is, or maybe he thinks he's going to have a friendlier jury. In the John Edwards case, Edwards' lawyers famously stood before the jury and said John Edwards has committed many sins, but no crimes. And that could be Donald Trump's defense as well, because in order to prove if, in fact, this these misdemeanor counts of falsifying business records in order to get them to felonies. If that's what the evidence shows, they connect it to a campaign finance violation. Every juror, all 12 of them, will have to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that Donald Trump paid off Stormy Daniels in order to protect his campaign, rather than just protect his family or avoid general embarrassment or anything like that. Donald Trump is undoubtedly not the first wealthy New York man to falsify business records by paying money to somebody he had an affair with. This is an unusual case that way. Many of them are not prosecuted. This one is, and the jump to a felony, which could be other crimes as well, does suggest that Alvin Bragg knows, he's got to hit a home run here. He's under a lot of pressure, and it looks like he's swinging for the fences.
And what makes this particularly unusual and different from the Edwards case is that Donald Trump is denying he had the affairs, right? John Edwards admitted he had the affair. And he was saying, look, I wanted to protect my family, et cetera. Donald Trump's saying it didn't even happen. These affairs just were not true. So that makes it a more sort of complicated defense to some degree.
The other question, too, is why didn't federal prosecutors move forward with this? Why would this be prosecuted at the state level? And that's been untested if this is the route in which they're going.
Right. Well, we have to figure out, are they charging under a state election law crime or a federal election law crime? Yes. But it is definitely the case that the feds decided for a variety of reasons not to prosecute. But so did the local DA. Cyrus Vance, after Michael Cohen pled guilty, Cyrus Vance was the previous DA in Manhattan. Yep. And he had opened this investigation into the hush money and decided not to prosecute for whatever reason. And Alvin Bragg didn't prosecute in his first year or so. And there are going to be real questions that I think he has to answer at the press conference that he's going to hold later today, which is not just what's in the indictment, and it's a question you asked before, David, but why now?
And we'll hope that Alvin Bragg will shed some light on that. He is expected to talk after this arraignment here today in this courtroom. Again, you're looking at a live picture right now, the 15th floor, the only camera in that building. It allowed us to see the former president walking into court, a very stern-looking former president, just a couple of seconds, but finding and locking in on that camera lens. Some would say it plays to his skill set. He knows where to find the camera. He went into the courtroom, and then the only cameras that were in the court are still cameras because his legal team successfully argued before the judge not to have TV cameras in the courtroom, saying it would create a circus-like atmosphere, which explains the still photos. Those photos come to us moments before the proceedings began. Again, our team, Aaron Katersky, John Santucci, Catherine Falders, all joining in reporting at this hour that the indictment is 34 felony counts of falsifying business records. We don't know if that is all of them, but at least 34 felony counts of falsifying business records. The question, as Dan and Kate rightly point out, is how did they get it to that felony level? Are they connecting it to state campaign finance laws, federal laws? Either route would be a challenge for the prosecutor. And again, when we talk about a speaking indictment, it's largely believed that Alvin Bragg in this indictment, once the public gets its hands on it, will offer one of these speaking indictments, essentially the narrative, the story behind why the DA would choose to bring these charges against a former president, would choose to make history in this unprecedented moment that we're witnessing, why they rose to this level. We'll learn much more about all of that as the day wears on. But what you're looking at right now in that hallway, of course, the layers of security, they clearly, you can see it on their faces. This is a day like any other, but in many ways it's not. And I'm sure they know both sides of this. They're there to do their job. We've all come in contact with these officers before, whether it's through jury duty or covering a court case in the past. They just happen to be there on a day when the former president is the criminal defendant. Aaron Katersky continues at his post just outside criminal court. And Aaron, I know you're trying to wrap your head a bit. And again, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but wrapping our head around the idea of 34 felony counts of falsifying business records and how this could perhaps connect directly to Michael Cohen and what he offered the DA.
I can get to 33 so far, David, just based on what we know about the reimbursement of the $130,000 from Donald Trump to Michael Cohen, his one-time fixer and attorney who actually wrote the check to Stormy Daniels in the closing weeks of the 2016 campaign. There were 11 reimbursement checks sent to Michael Cohen, and each of those can represent a count. There's the bad check, there's the bad invoice, and then there's the bad entry on the Trump Organization's general ledger. So 11 reimbursement payments times each of those three things gets you to 33 felony counts, assuming the counts have been elevated by some underlying crime, some reason why the business records were allegedly falsified. What's the 34th count? Still waiting to find out as we wait to get our hands on that indictment, David.
Again, the former president inside court now for well more than a half an hour. As they go down these counts, he has pleaded not guilty to the crimes laid out. And as we were talking earlier, we believe going in, and we wanted to wait until we heard officially, but we believe going in that many of these counts would mirror one another, and that's exactly what we're seeing play out.
Yeah, and you heard Aaron Katersky laying it out there, right? Which is that it's all out of the same series of events, and that there are numerous counts, which is not atypical of prosecutors laying out a case and filing a series of charges. I want to read, though, from the actual definition of falsifying business records in New York State. It's with the intent to defraud that you make or even cause through other means a false entry in an enterprise's business records. Pretty straightforward as to what it is. Now, whether all of these will fall under this section, because there are a number of subsections under this, we shall see. But that's the basic law that you're talking about here. And, there are going to be questions that the defense will raise about what does it mean, the intent to defraud. Well, who were they trying to defraud? Joe Tacopina has been on television many times saying, who was the victim here, et cetera. And there will be debates and discussions about the legal definitions, et cetera. But the law, pretty simple.
I want to bring in Sarah Isgur to join the conversation. Of course, worked in the Trump years with the Attorney General, the Deputy Attorney General. And Sarah, you see a direct correlation here between the number of counts you're seeing here so far, 34 felony counts, and the guilty plea from Michael Cohen.
Well, another option here, this is all pretty uncharted waters to take this state felony charge and need to tie in, as Dan and Kate were saying, to hide or facilitate some other crime. One possibility, of course, is this will be Donald Trump-related campaign finance violation. But another possibility is to tie it into Michael Cohen's plea deal. He was convicted of a campaign finance violation related to these payments as well. Again, it would be much stronger in that case because they would actually have a federal conviction. Otherwise, you actually have a local district attorney here trying to basically need to prove up a uncharged, unindicted federal case against Donald Trump, which I think will be a much harder uphill battle.
Michael Cohen, of course. Sarah, thank you. Michael Cohen, a pivotal witness in this case. That's not being questioned. There is a lot of incoming for him as well. People have questioned his lies in the past. He's acknowledged lying himself. He said he lied to serve his boss, the former president, when he was an attorney and fixer for him. But Michael Cohen in recent days has been emphatic, John Carl. He said that what he has offered the DA is backed up with paperwork and evidence.
Paperwork and evidence. And think about Michael Cohen, who had been so close to Donald Trump. He at one point said he would take a bullet for Donald Trump. He was about as loyal as anybody I saw around Donald Trump in the lead up to the 2016 campaign. And this is somebody who has served time for this very episode. He served more than a year in prison and about a year and a half in home confinement. Now, it wasn't solely related to the Stormy Daniels hush money payments. He also acknowledged and was convicted of lying to Congress on another Trump-related matter regarding the efforts to build a building in Moscow. But Michael Cohen, now the star witness, a flawed witness for those very reasons, but also somebody who has paid dearly, personally, his family has paid for his service to Donald Trump. Time behind bars, time confined to home, his career, his finances ruined because of his association with Donald Trump.
And David, you've spoken about the federal case. Why didn't the Justice Department do anything? Well, first of all, there was Justice Department policy that you could not indict the sitting president. Well, we have to look at the moments after President Trump leaves office. There was this thing called January 6th. And I can tell you their attention immediately focused on what happened, what was the president's role in that. And so this case, in their minds, became secondary based on all the tea leaves that I've been able to report out. It was not something that DOJ was going to focus on. They have left this to the local prosecutor, in this case, the district attorney, to proceed with. That's why it's going to be so important for us to actually look at these charges and figure out what they're built on. What's the basis of it? The federal investigations are proceeding separate and apart from this, but they know, obviously, that the people's view of the judicial system and whether it's fair or not is being impacted by this case.
I want to bring in Governor Chris Christie, former governor, former prosecutor. Chris, can you explain to the audience why federal authorities did not proceed here and why this would be the Manhattan district attorney who would years later pick up this case?
Well, obviously, we weren't in the room when the decisions were made, but I do think that this is a perfect example of prosecutorial discretion. You know, federal prosecutors and prosecutors throughout the American system are given the discretion, even if they believe a crime may have been committed, to make an evaluation. Is this worth the expenditure of resources compared to the other challenges I have in my particular jurisdiction? And I think it's where Pierre's comments come particularly into focus here. You know, when you look at the timing of all this, no doubt there's DOJ policy that says impeachment is the only way to deal with a sitting president. So now once you get past January 20th, DOJ has to look at the resources they're bringing to bear here. They wanted those resources to be brought to bear on January 6th, I'm sure. And that was a prosecutorial judgment made probably by the Attorney General of the United States and passed down to the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York to say, we're not wasting our time and resources on this. Our focus regarding Donald Trump's conduct is going to be on the intervening problem of January 6th and what crimes were committed there by people in his orbit, by the people on Capitol Hill, and ultimately maybe by the president himself. And so, you know, prosecutorial discretion is an important part of what makes our system different than the European system, for instance. And this is where I think Alvin Bragg is going to get himself open for the most criticism. With crime running as rampant as it is, violent crime, in the borough of Manhattan and all across the city of New York, but his jurisdiction, the borough of Manhattan, people are going to wonder, all these resources that are being spent on this matter, a 7-year-old hush money case, is that really making the security and safety of the people of Manhattan better? And is this really what they should spend their time on? DOJ obviously made that determination regarding this versus January 6th. Alvin Bragg's made his determination. They'll both be judged by it.
Legitimate questions, all to be asked in the days and weeks ahead. Chris Christie, thank you. Let's bring in Heidi Heitkamp, former Senator Heitkamp. And Heidi, you've been watching this unfold here today, and just your initial reaction here to learning 34 felony counts of falsifying records.
My initial reaction is Donald Trump is not a happy man. He never likes being in a room where he's not in charge. And so this is a tough day for him. My second thing is, where's Melania? I mean, when you look at this, you can do all the legal analysis, but Donald Trump knows that he's on a huge stage today. Everyone's watching. And behind all of this boring kind of business falsification argument is allegations of sexual liaisons that Donald Trump has not ever agreed that actually happened, but yet the public now is going to see this whole issue opened up again. And so if Donald Trump's going to be successful moving, seeking and securing the presidency, he needs to move one group that he lost between 16 and 20, and that's suburban, Republican-leaning women, and they aren't going to like what they see in this indictment. They aren't going to like, Donald Trump's between a rock and a hard place politically right now, because if he acknowledges the liaison and says it was no big deal, I did this, purposefully, NDAs were signed, then you're going to have a bad political problem with the group that you need to secure for the presidency. And so the political ramifications are very stark here, in my opinion.
You know, we asked the governor, we've asked him, a number of contributors here, Heidi, what they made of the 3 or 4 seconds of the former president going into the courtroom. You know, he lasered in on the camera, those still images of him flanked by his attorneys. You know, you've watched the Trump years unfold. What did you make of those images?
And I've spent time with the president, and if you look, there for a moment, he narrows his eyes. It's kind of a stink eye at the camera. I don't think he feels defeated nearly as much as he is seething with anger because he is not in control. He thinks and believes that this is all nonsense, and he's got to go through this very difficult process. And at the end of the day, I think he's smart enough to know this may reignite the MAGA base. He may be the martyr for the MAGA movement. But this is not a procedure that helps him secure the presidency of the United States.
Heidi Heitkamp. Heidi, we always appreciate your contributions as well. Our thanks to you and to Governor Christie. I want to bring in Mark Updegrove, presidential historian, LBJ Library, of course, in Austin. And Mark, just big picture here for people watching, and no matter what your opinion is about Donald Trump, what your opinion is about this particular case, knowing that there are a multitude of other cases out there still, you know, coming down the tracks here. What do you make of the unprecedented nature of this day?
Well, you said it, David, and we hear it time and time and time again as it relates to Donald Trump. Unprecedented. I think it was mentioned earlier that infamous trip down the escalator at Trump Tower when Trump announced his candidacy. That was unprecedented. So much he did during his campaign in 2015 and 2016, unprecedented. So much he did in the White House as president, unprecedented, and now as a former president. This is truly unprecedented. I think what strikes me in this moment, David, is the somberness, the weight. You can feel it. It's palpable in the scene that we're seeing there, in that photograph you showed of Donald Trump earlier before the judge. You could see it in Trump's countenance, and I think it reminds me most of another unprecedented occasion when Richard Nixon resigned from office in 1974. You could feel the weight of the occasion in that moment as well. You could see it on Nixon's face. And I think this image here that we're seeing before us now will become one of the icons of our age. For now, it'll be a symbol of defiance for Trump supporters, for those detractors of Donald Trump, a symbol of his criminality. But certainly that is an image that we'll see that will symbolize this very divided age in which we are right now.
It's a really interesting comparison, Mark, and you point out the similarities. Let me ask you about one thing, at least, that's distinctively different, and that is the fact that a number, if not most, Republicans on the Hill have rallied behind this president. We know, ultimately Republicans came in to tell Richard Nixon that essentially this was over. You're facing impeachment.
And David, that is the marked difference here. You're absolutely right. Prior to Nixon's resignation in August of 1974, congressional Republicans came to the Oval Office to tell Richard Nixon that he faced almost certain impeachment in the House and likely conviction in the Senate, so he should resign for the good of the country. The Republicans were almost united in that respect. Americans were far less divided at that time. Richard Nixon left with an approval rating of just 24%. As a comparison, Donald Trump, even after January 6th, left with an approval rating of 34% and is now, as has been mentioned, the lead candidate for the Republican nomination. We saw in the wake of these charges, his poll numbers increase, his lead against DeSantis widen, and money pour into the Trump campaign. Again, another symbol of the very divided times in which we live.
And part of the unprecedented nature of this moment, and it will be fascinating to watch unfold, is what these Republican candidates do and say in the weeks and months ahead with all of these other cases pending, Mark. I'm curious if that's something, obviously, that you wait and will be watching closely. If there's a shift in tone, once you see where these other cases could potentially go with the Jack Smith, the special counsel investigating January 6th, the documents at Mar-a-Lago, not just the documents themselves, but obviously allegations of obstruction, and in Fulton County, Georgia, and the allegations that there was some pressure to, find the votes. People remember that recording. Whether or not Republican candidates who right now would like the nomination themselves, but are still supporting Donald Trump, if that political calculation will change, given what we see in the months ahead here.
It's interesting, David. We saw Trump come out with those NFT cards, those trading cards, a little while back, and one of them was of him as a superhero. But there has not yet been kryptonite for Donald Trump. This is another drip in the wake that affects Trump's candidacy. We have to remember that while he retains great strength among a certain segment of the Republican Party, he lost the election in 2020. There was a disastrous midterm for the Republicans last year, as mostly around the election deniers who were in Trump's camp. So we'll see what this charge and the charges in those other cases do to erode Trump's credibility and affect his candidacy for the presidency next year. It's anybody's guess. He has been almost impossible to predict. We use the term.
Again, the Zoom connection tests us all the time, but that was quite a tease from Mark Updegrove. We'll get his final part of that thought, because it was a good one. And I do want to bring in Rick Klein, our political director, because Rick, as our eyes are trained, there's some activity here, Secret Service coming out. Let's just stick with this live picture for a moment. There he is, the former president. Let's listen.
President Trump, how did you plead? President Trump. Everyone is to stay put.
And there you have it. A rarity right there playing out, too. I mean, the back of his head, it is rare that with questions being tossed his way, that the former president would ignore them. But in this moment, he did.
Especially with the question that was shouted at him, how did you plead? I mean, I've been in that situation where you just want to say something to get a response, and he's usually pretty predictable. That was a pretty good line to put in the water, because he could have just turned around and said not guilty, but he didn't. Again, it could be a seething anger that we will see erupt when he gets back to Mar-a-Lago, or more of that melancholy that we've said, or maybe some of both. But that is, I think we can agree, not a happy Donald Trump.
Not a happy Donald Trump. His eyes pierced the camera on the way in. On the way out, he was really tested by one of those reporters, and for years it was Hugh John Garl. And as you say, lobbed one of those questions, very simple. He said going in, through our reporting, that we knew there'd be a not guilty plea. Look, but what we didn't know was whether he would offer that himself. This was the opportunity, as you say, but in that moment, he decided not to. And, he has a skill set, and I'm sure we'll see later on today perhaps an indication as to why he didn't think this was the particular moment. Rick Klein, as we look at this hallway, this is the 15th floor, obviously, criminal court. Donald Trump has now left after almost an hour, I believe. We'll get a direct number on how long he was actually in that courtroom as they read the indictment. Rick is our political director. You'll remember him from election night over at the big board. And Rick, I just always like to help folks at home remember the big picture here. And regardless of whether or not he has pleaded not guilty here, 34 felony counts our team is reporting of falsifying business records. Regardless of this, of the history made today, this does not impact whether or not someone can run for president. He will move forward full steam ahead in his race for the White House.
There is nothing that stops him from continuing his campaign for the presidency. There's nothing that stops him from even being elected to the presidency, even if he's under indictment, even if he is potentially convicted. His campaign sending out a fundraising appeal with a fake mugshot, a mugshot that does not exist, asking for people to contribute. That's the campaign public face that they're trying to put on this, the spin they're trying to put on this. I think, though, the dour images of Trump in that courtroom speak more truthfully to the reality of this moment. And I think it's a mistake to assume that this helps him politically. Yes, there are Republicans rallying to his defense, but they're doing so around the idea that this prosecutor is overreaching, that he is out of control. They're not rallying to his defense around the substance of these charges, and they will play out over months and months, a year plus, as John Carl pointed out. It could be in the context not just of the Republican primary, but the general election. That's where he may see a lot more political vulnerability. This is a real thing now. This is changes and resets everything around the presidential nominating contest, even as Trump forges ahead with his campaign.
Well, just look at this, Rick. We're looking at live pictures of the motorcade already on the move. That shows you how quickly you could get out of that criminal courthouse if you're given the elevator reserved for judges, which is what our reporting tells us in the case of Donald Trump today. We have color from inside the courtroom. Our Catherine Falder's reporting that the former president did enter the not guilty plea himself, and that it was Todd Blanche. This is the new attorney that Donald Trump brought onto the team in the last 24 hours, at least acknowledged it publicly that there had been an additional defense attorney added who did most of the speaking inside that courtroom here.
And David, as you see those images of the motorcade leaving, what the Secret Service wants to do, get him in and get him out. They wanted this to be very businesslike, professional. I think they probably even negotiated with the Trump team that he probably wouldn't do much speaking at the courthouse, either before or after. That's what you're seeing unfold. He will be moving toward the airport promptly, we're being told. So again, for their part, the security of getting the president in the building, have him processed, have the proceeding go forward, then move him out, because trust me, the Secret Service wants to be out of this business. They want him on the campaign, all of the things that he will do going forward in a more normal sense. This was anything but normal. They had to put together the security package. He's now in the security bubble. Now they want to get him out of the city and back to Mar-a-Lago.
They want him back on that plane. They want New Yorkers safe and the former president safe. And if they can say that at the end of the day, they will have done their job. The Secret Service and the NYPD. And, you know, the officers who turn up at court every single day who we saw on cameras here for a good portion of this afternoon. As we look at this live picture of the motorcade, John, I know that you've been in touch with Catherine Falder's and our team with a little more of how this played out inside that courtroom.
A little bit, David. They're being very controlling right now. Our team is still inside the courtroom, but I'm being told by ABC's Laura Romero, president, as we've reported, David, pled not guilty, 34 counts. Laura says the president was calm throughout the proceedings, spoke very quietly, David, apparently only speaking to enter that not guilty plea and then whispering to his lawyers as the proceedings were ongoing. But we're still getting a readout from the team in there, David. I think they'll be hopefully out shortly and will be able to join us in our coverage.
Yep, raise your hand as soon as you hear from any of them, and we will go to them just for a description of inside that court. Here is an image right now of the former president leaving the courtroom. This is, of course, moments ago, since you're watching the motorcade on the left-hand side of your screen. But again, as quickly as he went into the courthouse today, no interest on his part of approaching those cameras. Perhaps that was just part of the speculation at the beginning of the day, or the bravado, until the heaviness of the moment starts to sink in.
And I think it was smart, right? I think he dealt with it the right way, which is it's smarter for him to just take the proceeding itself seriously, go back to Mar-a-Lago, hold a press conference tonight where he completely bashes the DA and the entire process, right? At least it allows him to separate it out and to not suggest that he's not even taking this seriously, et cetera.
Completely bashes? You think you'll hear some of the same rhetoric?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, John would know better than me, but I would expect we're going to hear the same level of rhetoric. I don't think anything will have fundamentally changed from just having been in the courtroom. I would expect that he's going to bash the DA, he's going to bash the charges, et cetera, right?
There are no ramifications for that now that he's appeared before the judge?
No, I think, look, he's got his freedom of speech, he's got his right to make comments. As long as there's not a gag order in place about the case, he can say what he wants.
Really, there's no legal calculation now.
I mean, certainly the lawyers will counsel him to keep it down. You don't win any points by irritating or personally attacking a judge, by seeming to intimidate a prosecutor or witnesses. But Donald Trump is Donald Trump, and as we were talking about earlier, this is now his presidential campaign. Yeah. He's not just attacking Democrats anymore. He's just not attacking Joe Biden. As a matter of fact, that's going to become secondary. It already, in a way, has become secondary to his main focus, which is to say that he has been a victim, that these prosecutors are out to get him, and they're out to get him because what they're really out to get is they're out to get you, my supporters across America.
John, as you and I both know, as we study these live images right now, the person who will be studying these images the moment he's on that plane is the former president.
You know, he was watching cable television last night. Can you imagine? You come into New York, you know, the night before you're going to be indicted. He's huddled with, as we've reported, his legal team, but also his handful of political aides. No family to speak of. Eric Trump was on hand for at least part of it, but he's there. He's hate watching cable television, looking at how it's playing, how it's being covered, and I can guarantee you that's what will be on his airplane as he flies back to West Palm Beach. No question.
And will he ask the question that you've heard before? You know, how did that play? My moment looking at the camera. Do you think that was the right way to handle that?
I mean, he's going to be doing that, and he's going to be focused on what's going to happen tonight. And I think that one measure of how worried he is now, concerned he is about all of this, is does he stick to the script tonight? Because there will be a script.
I gather that script is being
undoubtedly, yes,
tweaked as we speak.
Yes.
Now, whether or not he goes along with the tweaks, the suggestions from his team.
Yeah, and what he does, but even after that, the question is, does he read what's in the prompter?
Wow, we're getting an interesting headline coming in right now. I want to go to Aaron Gutersky, who's in Lower Manhattan, because, Aaron, there was something the judge had requested when it comes to social media. Tell us about this and how far did this get?
Well, we know that the arraignment itself, him pleading not guilty, David, took just minutes. But part of the reason why he was in there for the better part of an hour is the prosecutors gave a rather lengthy soliloquy in court. Part of that included showing the judge images of at least 2 threats that have been made to Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, who was there seated in the courtroom. And they asked the judge for a protective order in the case over all of the discovery, over all of the evidence that needs to be shared with the defense. We'll get a read shortly as to whether the judge granted it, but it just goes to show how charged this entire criminal case has been, that the prosecutors are asking for that protective order and making the judge aware of the threats to the prosecutor. Alvin Bragg had received a white powder in the mail in the basement of this building. It also contained a letter that said, "Alvin, I'm going to kill you." That followed one of the president's social media messages asking his supporters to protest on his behalf.
And again, just to reiterate what Aaron Gutersky is reporting at this hour, prosecutors, part of what took up this time when we did not see activity, and we were waiting for activity in that hallway for the president to reemerge, part of that time was taken up by prosecutors who were making the case before this judge, Juan Merchan, that there should be some sort of a protective order, at least when it comes to social media, given the threats against the district attorney in this case, Alvin Bragg. That, according to reporting moments ago from Aaron Gutersky, what's unclear at this point, and this is the part of the sort of the fog of when we watch these events unfold, and not an event like this because this is unprecedented, but we will have more information as to whether or not that was granted by the judge a short time from now. We'll go back to Aaron as soon as he learns. I want to bring in Olivia Rubin, who's on the phone. Olivia is with our investigative unit. And Olivia, you witnessed some of this today. What can you offer as far as the temperature in that room inside that courthouse?
That's right, David. I'm standing right outside the courthouse right now, and I can tell you we just ran out, and the temperature inside of that courtroom was very high. It was very tense, and like you've noted, it was an incredibly long hearing. It ran almost an hour. I can say one of the most remarkable moments was when the former president entered into that courtroom, and I can honestly only describe his face as almost having a grimace on it as he made his way to the front of the room where he sat at the defendant's table. And I know this was hinted at earlier, David, on the broadcast, but this is the former president of the United States entering into the courtroom as a defendant. And David, he had to wait in his chair there for the judge until the judge eventually came in. He told the former president to stand. He stood up. Trump sat back down, and ultimately the judge said, "Let's arraign Mr. Trump." And Trump entered that guilty plea on his own. He said, "Not guilty." And that was what kicked off sort of this longer hearing where the prosecutors brought up a number of issues. I know you mentioned the protective order. It seemed from the discussions that there was some agreement between the prosecutors and the defense that there could be this protective order as it pertains to discovery material. The prosecutor said that they only wanted Trump to have access to some of these materials in certain ways so that he could not disseminate them. The defense agreeing to some, the judge ultimately not weighing in. But I do also want to go to this remarkable moment that sort of sparked this conversation about the threats, where the prosecutor brought up the post. Of course, he has attacked the judge. He has attacked Bragg himself, who was in the room there. And this moment, David, where one of the prosecutors actually passed around copies of Trump's social media posts attacking people who were in that very room. And he walked over and he put those posts on Trump's defense table, David.
A remarkable scene described by Olivia Rubin. Stick with us here, Olivia. Olivia describing how events unfolded inside that courtroom, Judge Juan Merchan's courtroom. Olivia describing the former president walking in. We saw the version from the hallway. Olivia saw it from inside the room, describing the grimace, the former president sitting down at the defense table, the judge in that courtroom asking the former president to stand. Asking him what his plea was. Olivia describing the former president in his own words, saying not guilty, something that we thought would play out and did in fact play out in that courtroom. Olivia, I wanted to ask you more about the threats, because this is going to be part of this story unfolding that we're still learning about, this request from the prosecution that the judge impose some sort of protective order about threats moving forward, dangerous rhetoric, social media, if you will. What more can you tell us about that? And what was the reaction? You mentioned some of this was put on the defense table, I gather, in front of the former president. Was there any reaction?
David, we could not see the former president the entire time there, but what I can say is that he sat in his seat and he was essentially stone-faced, looking forward. He did not crack a smile. He didn't seem to turn around and take in the room while he was sitting there. Of course, he would lean side to side as his attorneys would whisper in his ears. He looked attentively as he was speaking. He would blink and take it in. There was this moment where the prosecutors brought up potentially a conflict of interest with one of Trump's attorneys, and the judge looked directly at the former president and said, I want to inform you that you have the right for conflict-free representation. Do you understand that? It appears that the president nodded, which the judge didn't seem was good enough. He put his hand to his ear and he said, I can't hear you. And the president had to speak up again and say yes. And so it was those types of moments that made it so abundantly clear that the former president in this room was a defendant, David. He was at the will of the judge, and he had to sit through, as we've described, what was nearly a 1-hour hearing. And by the end, the judge was reading to him sort of these, what he described as, commonplace, usual directions that he gives to all defendants. And as he was ticking through them, the former president is sitting in his seat and he's saying, yes, yes. And I have to say, by this point of the hearing, the former president's voice had gone a little bit hoarse. It was not forceful. It was not projected. He had kind of gotten to the end of his line here almost, and that is sort of where the hearing ended.
Really important reporting from our investigative reporter and producer, Olivia Rubin. And one last question before I move on here, Olivia, because you were also the first window to Judge Juan Merchan for us as well. There had been some question about what the demeanor would be in that courtroom, business as usual, and what this is like when you juxtapose someone who has the skill set of the former president in the public eye, the public sphere, entering that courtroom, and how quickly the dynamic shifts when you're a criminal defendant. You're describing a situation where the judge is, asking for an answer and says, I can't hear you, asking the former president to speak up, if you will. It would sound like the judge, and you tell me, seemed to be making it clear that at least in that courtroom, he was the one leading the way, the one in charge here.
Absolutely. And there were give and takes throughout the hearing, David. There were times when the judge would listen and he would say, of course, this is an exceptional circumstance. And he acknowledged what it took to simply get the former president into the courtroom today and the resources it took from the city, from the Secret Service, from all aspects. But there were also times when he would say, I do want to say this is what we would do with another defendant. So, for example, he did not outright allow the former president to not attend the next hearing in the case, which is as of now set for December. He said in the interest of transparency, he could need to be here. There was not a final decision on that, but even just that ruling right there gives you a sense of what could be in store here. He did say, sorry, it's a bit loud outside the courthouse, but he did say he did not want to impose a gag order. He did not think we were there at all because just like every other defendant, the former president has rights here.
Olivia Rubin with us. Olivia Rubin, who is our investigative reporter on the investigative unit here at ABC. She was in that courtroom describing somewhat of a surreal scene, though all of this has been today. A situation where she says there was give and take between the judge, Juan Merchan, and the former president, Donald Trump. Moments when the judge asked him to essentially, speak up. I can't hear you. The former president pleading not guilty himself in his own words, standing before the judge, but also a judge who understood the historic nature of what was unfolding in his courtroom, respectful of the fact that there was a former president standing before him, and the extraordinary nature of this case and the security involved, the logistics involved in getting the former president into that building up to that 15th floor. In her words, there was give and take, and that is also encouraging because this was certainly a test of the legal system. And again, Dan, you and I have been talking about all afternoon here, this sort of this moment in history where the political world, clashes with the legal world in a really significant way. But, that scene described as polite, assertive on both sides, and a request before that judge from prosecutors about some sort of protection moving forward when it comes to social media and the number of threats. But I do want to get to the indictment because we do have it in our hands, a number of us do. I want to get right to Aaron Katersky first because, Aaron, you have covered these indictments in criminal court for us for many years. What stands out to you so far?
Well, David, it is not a speaking indictment, as you were discussing. There is no language other than the straight matters of the criminal charges, 34 of them, to which former President Trump pleaded not guilty, uttering those words in his own voice before Judge Juan Merchan. It simply says the defendant in the county of New York and elsewhere, beginning on February 14, 2017, with intent to defraud and intent to commit another crime, and aid and conceal the commission thereof, made and caused a false entry in the business records of an enterprise. This is how the district attorney's office has elevated a charge that is normally a misdemeanor to a felony because it was done with the intent to commit another crime and conceal the commission of another crime. That other crime, as we understand it, is a conspiracy to promote or prevent the election of 2 or more people in New York. David.
Aaron Katersky, outside criminal court. Aaron, stick with us here because we're just getting a statement now from the district attorney, Alvin Bragg, who is expected to address the public here a short time from now. I want to read from this statement for those of you at home. The DA, Alvin Bragg, today announcing the indictment of Donald J. Trump. And this is important here because this helps to describe, as Aaron said, the list of charges, the counts, without much of an explanation in the indictment. Well, here's where he's filling the blanks here. He says, Alvin Bragg indicting Donald Trump for falsifying New York business records in order to conceal damaging information and unlawful activity from American voters before and after the 2016 election. The DA's office goes on to say, during the election, Trump and others employed a, quote, catch-and-kill scheme to identify, purchase, and bury negative information about him and to boost his electoral prospects. That would seem to be the first significant window from the DA's office, Dan.
It is, but as a legal matter, I think that the 34 counts, it appears, just relate to the $130,000 payout to Stormy Daniels. So what it seems to me, and Kate can correct me or Pierre can correct me if they think I'm wrong, but it seems to me that what they've done is they've laid out the context for what was happening, right, in this press release. They basically talked about how from 2015 to 2017 that Trump orchestrated a catch-and-kill scheme, as you pointed out, through a series of payments. But when it comes to the actual charges, it goes down to say, in total, 34 false entries were made in New York business records to conceal the initial covert $130,000 payment. And that seems to be where the charges are stemming from as we go through this. And each one of the charges, as Aaron Katersky had laid it out, relate to either a check or a false recording in their business records, an invoice, a marked record. Each one of those is considered another count here. And as we expected, they have said that a violation, and it's unclear if it's state or federal, because it says here, including attempts to violate state and federal election laws, which seems to be what took this from a misdemeanor to a felony. And Pierre seems to...
There's another key line in here which underscores what you're saying here. The DA's office saying in this press release, Trump is charged in a New York State Supreme Court indictment with 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree, which signals that it's a felony. But again, all 34 counts directly related to falsifying business records, Kate.
They are, and the press release accompanying the indictment suggests that the scheme itself is being charged as a scheme designed to bury negative information to boost the former president's electoral prospects, and there's a reference made to attempts to violate both state and federal election laws. So the scheme is sort of being charged as the one we have been anticipating, but there's not as much clarity as you might expect in some of these documents regarding what specific federal and state election laws are being used to boost this misdemeanor to a felony, now, or these misdemeanors to felonies. Now, it's not that those need to be charged separately, right? The way this New York law works is it becomes a felony if committed in furtherance of another crime. You don't have to prove or actually even charge the other crime, but the sort of generality of the reference to the other crimes is surprising, at least to me. We don't yet know the full legal theory.
And David, we'll have to print out the statement of facts that accompanies the indictment. But what you essentially see from the district attorney here is he's making the case that this was a conspiracy to use this catch and kill philosophy, i.e., we're going to take this story out from the public domain so it never sees the light of day. So, in fact, Donald Trump can continue his effort to become the president of the United States. And they're saying that it violates both state and federal law, that scheme.
You catch the story, you pay for it, but then you never print it. You
Exactly.
catch and kill it. That's the allegation here. And again, this is the indictment, which isn't a speaking indictment, but you can get the sense of the size of this here. These are the charges laid out, and then what we're basing so far, the narrative provided by the DA comes in a two-page sort of press release, if you will. Alvin Bragg is going to address the public a short time from now. He'll face many of the questions, the open-ended questions that we have here at the table. John?
David, there's also an introduction here, in addition to the press statement and the list of counts, that goes through in detail this catch and release process that was going on, and it's described. And there's some new details in here, but it's describing the head of the company that owned the National Enquirer telling Trump in a meeting at Trump Tower in 2015 that this is David Pecker, would act as his eyes and ears for the campaign by looking out for negative stories about the defendant and alerting lawyer A before the stories were published. That lawyer A, of course, would be Michael Cohen. One of the stories mentioned specifically is a story revolving a Trump Tower